By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman world had become too vast for a single ruler to manage. The 3rd century had left Rome exhausted. Civil wars, rapid-fire emperors, frontier collapses, plagues, and economic freefall had pushed imperial authority to its breaking point. Provinces drifted toward independence, generals carved out their own power bases, and the illusion of a unified Mediterranean empire grew increasingly fragile. By 284 CE, the Roman state did not need incremental fixes, it needed structural reinvention. And into this fractured world stepped Diocletian. Born in the Balkans and hardened by decades of military service, Diocletian understood what many emperors before him had refused to accept. The crisis was not merely political, and not simply economic. It was systemic. The empire's size, administrative complexity, and constant military pressure had outpaced the capacity of a single central authority. If Rome was to survive, the very machinery of government had to change. Diocletian's answer was both radical and pragmatic. The Tetrarchy, a rule of 4. Instead of relying on one emperor to command legions from Spain to Syria, Diocletian established a dual hierarchy. He himself ruled as Augustus of the East, with Maximian as Augustus of the West. Beneath them served 2 junior emperors, Caesars, Galerius in the east and Constantius in the west. This was not simply a delegation of power, it was a new political architecture. Each ruler governed from a different administrative center, each regionally attuned, each positioned to respond rapidly to frontier threats. This system, for all its later fragility, reflects an essential truth. The balance of power was shifting decisively toward the eastern Mediterranean. The East had long been the wealthier half of the empire. Cities such as Antioch, Alexandria, and Nicomedia formed dense networks of commerce and administration. Their tax bases were stronger, their urban populations larger, their infrastructure more resilient. Diocletian recognized that the future of Roman governance and its survival lay here. Thus he made Nicomedia, modern Izmit, his primary residence. While Rome remained symbolically central, the emperor's physical presence told a different story. Coins minted during his reign depict imperial workshops relocated closer to the eastern frontier. Inscriptions found in Asia Minor reference expanded administrative offices and newly empowered provincial governors. Archaeology reveals large-scale construction programs, palatial complexes, military installations, and bureaucratic quarters that signal a state reorganizing itself around a new geopolitical axis. This shift was not only strategic, it was structural. The East offered defensible borders, shorter logistical lines, and long-established financial networks capable of supporting large, permanent armies. In Diocletian's calculus, Rome's future strength depended on anchoring the imperial government in regions where resilience was already built into the landscape. But administrative geography was only one dimension. To stabilize the empire, Diocletian needed to rebuild its internal mechanisms. The first target was the military, the backbone of imperial authority. The army had swelled during the crisis years, but its loyalties were unreliable. Diocletian expanded and reorganized it, distinguishing between mobile field armies, comitatenses, and frontier troops, limitanei. These reforms ensured rapid response forces could be deployed where needed while long-term garrisons held the borders. Then came the tax reforms, some of the most consequential in Roman history. Diocletian assessed land and population more systematically, imposing a new, regularized tax system known as the capitatio iugatio. This was designed to produce predictable state revenue and reduce corruption. It was deeply unpopular in some regions, yet it stabilized the imperial budget enough to sustain larger armies and broader bureaucratic operations. His economic interventions were equally ambitious. Facing spiraling inflation, Diocletian issued the famous edict on maximum prices, a vast attempt to control the cost of goods and services across the entire empire. Though it ultimately failed, fragments preserved on stone slabs from the eastern provinces reveal a state striving to impose order on markets that had become chaotic during the crisis years. All of this required a much larger bureaucracy. Provincial boundaries were redrawn, new administrative districts created, and layers of civil service expanded to implement imperial directives. The empire that emerged was more centralized, more hierarchical, and far more capable of projecting authority across great distances. During Diocletian's reign, the symbolic and functional divide between East and West sharpened. Western provinces, rural, economically strained, and militarily vulnerable, increasingly depended on the stability and resources of the East. Meanwhile, the eastern half flourished. Archaeological traces from late 3 RD and early 4th century Nicomedia highlight its role as a proto-capital. Monumental palace remains, administrative complexes, and road expansions reflect the tectonic political shift underway. Diocletian had effectively laid the infrastructural groundwork for what would later become Byzantium's imperial model, a state centered on a fortified, economically robust eastern hub, defended by professional armies and administered by an expanding civil apparatus. He likely did not imagine Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire as we recognize them today. Yet the institutional DNA was unmistakably his. A more disciplined tax system, a professionalized military hierarchy, and a decentralized imperial structure were all seeds from which Eastern Roman governance would grow for centuries. These reforms set the stage for the next decisive transformation, the rise of Constantine. In 330 CE, an ancient Greek city on the Bosporus became the new heart of empire. Constantine's rise to power unfolded in a period still marked by the political volatility that Diocletian had attempted to resolve. After the abdication of Diocletian and Maximian in 305 CE, the tetrarchic system faltered under competing ambitions. Alliances shifted, succession disputes deepened, and rival emperors emerged across different regions. Into this fractured landscape entered Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus. Raised in the Eastern courts, educated in military administration, and shaped by the complexities of late imperial politics, Constantine possessed both the pedigree and the strategic acumen to navigate the struggle for supremacy. Upon his father's death in 306 CE, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the legions at Eboracum, York. While his initial position lacked formal tetrarchic endorsement, his military credibility and political legitimacy grew rapidly. Over the next 2 decades, he maneuvered through a series of civil wars, forming and breaking alliances as circumstances demanded. The most decisive moment came in 312 CE, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Facing his rival Maxentius for control of the Western Empire, Constantine's victory proved transformative. Ancient sources, including Lactantius and Eusebius, record Constantine attributing his triumph to divine support, marking the beginning of his association with Christianity, a relationship that would have profound consequences for the empire. The following year, in 313 CE, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. While modern scholarship notes that the document was less a universal charter than a practical agreement between co-rulers, it nonetheless assured legal toleration for Christianity and restored confiscated church property. This act did not instantly create a Christian empire. Traditional cults and diverse local religions continued to flourish, but it established a new legal baseline. Christianity could now operate openly, and imperial authority no longer aligned exclusively with pagan institutions. Constantine's subsequent patronage, including financial support for ecclesiastical building projects and involvement in doctrinal disputes, further integrated the church into the fabric of imperial governance. Yet Constantine's ambitions extended far beyond religious policy or military reunification. He recognized that Rome, though symbolically potent, no longer functioned effectively as the administrative center of a vast and diverse empire. It was geographically distant from frontier zones, economically overshadowed by the East, and politically constrained by entrenched senatorial elites. The empire required a capital positioned at a crossroads, one that could serve as a military command center and economic hub, and a unifying symbol for a newly consolidated imperial order. The site he selected was Byzantium, an ancient Greek city on the European shore of the Bosporus. Small in scale but strategically unparalleled, Byzantium controlled the passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Its position allowed oversight of key maritime routes and access to the rich hinterlands of Thrace and Anatolia. The surrounding waters provided natural defenses, while the peninsula itself offered a compact, easily fortified shape. For Constantine, the location embodied both opportunity and security. Beginning in the mid-320s, the reconstruction and expansion of the city proceeded rapidly. Archaeological remains provide the clearest picture of his vision. The Great Palace Complex, though modified extensively by later emperors, originated under Constantine as a central administrative residence. Its layout integrated ceremonial halls, residential quarters, and service areas, space designed not merely for habitation but for the performance of imperial authority. Adjacent to it stood the Hippodrome, whose construction began under the earlier Roman Emperor Septimius Severus but was completed and enlarged by Constantine. With seating for tens of thousands, the Hippodrome became a focal point of civic life, imperial ceremony, and political expression. The city was also encircled by fortifications. While the later Theodosian walls are better known, Constantine's early circuit wall marked the first step in converting the modest town into a defended imperial metropolis. The placement of gates and towers indicates a careful balance between accessibility and protection, reflecting the city's dual role as a commercial hub and military stronghold. Beneath its expanding surface, new water systems, storage facilities, and public buildings supported a growing population drawn by administrative opportunities and imperial investment. On May 11, 330 CE, the city was formally inaugurated under a new name, Constantinople. Ceremonies blended traditional Roman practices with Christian symbolism, reflecting the evolving identity of the empire. Constantine did not abandon Rome. Its senatorial institutions and ceremonial value persisted, but the practical focus of governance shifted decisively eastward. Constantinople was conceived not as a replacement but as a recentering of imperial power, aligned with demographic realities, economic strengths, and geopolitical necessities. Christianity, too, found institutional expression within the new capital. Constantine sponsored church construction throughout the city, including the original Church of the Holy Apostles, which would become imperial mausoleum and ecclesiastical landmark. These early foundations demonstrate the emerging relationship between church and state, not yet a unified ideological apparatus, but a partnership shaped by mutual interests. Imperial involvement in church councils, most famously the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, further illustrated Constantine's belief that religious unity served political stability. By the time of his death in 337 CE, Constantine had reshaped nearly every dimension of Roman governance. He had defeated rivals, unified the empire, institutionalized Christian toleration, and redefined the geographical and symbolic center of imperial power. The transformation was not instantaneous and not without contradiction, but its long-term consequences were profound. The Eastern Roman Empire would grow around the structures he established: administrative, military, and urban, and Constantinople would become the enduring nucleus of imperial authority for over 1,000 years. With the new capital established, a distinct Eastern imperial culture began to take shape. After Constantine's death, the empire fractured, yet the East held firm. The political landscape of the Roman world changed abruptly in 337 CE when Constantine died at Anserona, near Nicomedia. His passing created an immediate vacuum, and the carefully constructed unity of his reign dissolved within weeks. Although Constantine had intended a dynastic succession through his three sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, the transition was marred by violent purges. Contemporary sources, including Ammianus Marcellinus and later ecclesiastical historians, note that members of the wider Constantinian family were killed in a rapid consolidation of authority. The surviving heirs partitioned the empire among themselves. But the arrangement was unstable from the outset. Rivalries quickly developed, and civil conflict became inevitable. Constantius II, who governed the east, inherited the wealthiest and most administratively coherent portion of the empire. His rule extended over the Balkans, Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the vital urban economy anchored by Constantinople. While his brothers contested control of the west, Constantius focused on maintaining internal order and defending the eastern frontier. Records indicate that he continued many of Constantine's centralizing reforms, expanding court bureaucracy and reinforcing the role of imperial officials. The Eastern administration drew increasingly on a professionalized civil service, which helped preserve stability even as political tensions disrupted the western provinces. The ideological landscape of the court also shifted during Constantius' reign. Christianity, now legally tolerated and institutionally supported, became deeply embedded in imperial politics. However, Christian communities remained divided over theological questions, particularly the relationship between the Father and the Son. Constantius supported various compromise positions derived from the Arian controversy, influencing the appointment of bishops and the outcomes of synods. His involvement reflected a broader trend. Imperial authority had become a decisive force in shaping ecclesiastical structures. According to the Theodosian Code, laws regarding heresy, church discipline, and public order multiplied, demonstrating how religious policy became a tool of governance. Following the deaths of Constantine II in 340 CE and Constans in 350 CE, Constantius II emerged as sole ruler. Yet his final years were marked by external pressures from the Sasanian Empire and internal dissent. In 360 CE, the army in Gaul proclaimed Julian Constantius' cousin as Augustus. When Constantius died the following year, Julian inherited a unified empire. His attempt to restore traditional cults, reorganize administrative practices, and reduce central control over the church created a short-lived but notable departure from Constantinian precedents. Despite his reforms, Julian's death during the Persian campaign of 363 CE ended his program abruptly. His successor, Jovian, restored Christian privileges and negotiated a defensive peace with Persia, though at territorial cost. The brief reigns of Jovian and Valentinian I, in the west, introduced a new pattern. The empire was now governed by emperors chosen by the army rather than dynastic heirs. The east fell to Valens, brother of Valentinian I, in 364 CE. Valens' reign emphasized frontier defense and administrative continuity, but his support for Arian theology prolonged ecclesiastical divisions. The Gothic War, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, exposed the vulnerabilities of the Eastern military. Archaeologists have identified fortified settlements and military restructuring in the Balkans dating to this period, illustrating the empire's attempt to address threats along the Danube frontier. The defeat at Adrianople was a turning point. Valens' death left the Eastern Roman Empire without a clear successor, and the imperial court required a figure capable of stabilizing both military and administrative structures. The choice fell on Theodosius, a seasoned general from Hispania. His accession in 379 CE marked the beginning of a new phase of consolidation. Working with leading administrators, Theodosius reorganized the Eastern armies, integrated Gothic federates into the military system, and restored urban infrastructure damaged during the conflict. His legislation, preserved in the Theodosian Code, reflects a renewed emphasis on fiscal regularity, social order, and religious regulation. The Council of Constantinople in 381 CE became one of the defining moments of his early reign. Convened to resolve lingering theological disputes, the council reaffirmed the Nicene Creed and rejected Arian interpretations. While theological unity remained imperfect, the council confirmed the growing role of the Bishop of Constantinople as a senior ecclesiastical authority. The elevation of the Constantinopolitan See reflected both imperial support and the city's rising political status. It also signaled the developing institutional divergence between Eastern and Western Christianity, a process rooted in administrative realities rather than doctrinal intent. Court ceremonial reached new levels of complexity under Theodosius. The imperial court at Constantinople expanded its hierarchy of officials, adopting rituals that emphasized the distance between emperor and subject. These practices, described by later sources such as the Notitia Dignitatum, reinforced the centralized authority of the emperor and reflected the increasing professionalization of governance. Archaeological evidence from the Great Palace District indicates continuous construction during this period, including audience halls and administrative wings that facilitated both ceremonial display and bureaucratic work. Economically, the East continued to outpace the West. Its dense urban networks, productive agricultural zones, and lucrative trade routes supported a stronger tax base. Documentary finds, including papyri from Egypt and inscriptions from Asia Minor, reveal stable administrative routines. These resources allowed the Eastern Empire to sustain its armies and maintain public works even during periods of military strain. By contrast, the West faced declining revenues, political fragmentation, and increasing pressure from migrating groups. By the time of Theodosius' death in 395 CE, the empire had undergone profound transformation. Administrative continuity and economic strength allowed the East to maintain stability despite repeated conflicts. The fusion of Christian institutions with imperial governance had deepened, shaping policy and court culture. Meanwhile, the widening gap between the two halves of the empire, driven by economic, political, and military asymmetries, had become unmistakable. For the first time, the Roman world would be divided permanently between Eastern and Western courts. By 395 CE, the Roman world would split permanently, and the Eastern Empire would confront its first major trials. While the Western Empire crumbled, the East engineered its survival. Following the permanent division of the Roman world in 395 CE, the Eastern Empire faced immediate military and diplomatic challenges. The Danubian frontier, stretching from the Black Sea to the Alps, became a central zone of defense against Gothic incursions. The Visigoths, displaced by Hunnic movements from the Eurasian steppe, pressed into the Balkans, conducting raids that tested both local garrisons and the central administration. Alaric, the most prominent Gothic leader of this period, launched a series of campaigns between 395 and 401 CE, targeting key cities and supply lines. While contemporary Western sources emphasize the vulnerability of Rome itself, Eastern chroniclers, including Sozomen and Socrates Scholasticus, highlight that Constantinople remains secure, owing to both its formidable Theodosian walls and proactive logistical preparation. Archaeological studies of early 5th century fortifications in Thrace and the Balkans reveal substantial rebuilding and reinforcement of existing urban and military installations, reflecting a deliberate defensive strategy. The Eastern emperors, Arcadius, 395 to 408 CE, and later Theodosius II, 408 to 450 CE, relied heavily on diplomacy and fiscal incentives to manage external pressures. Annual tribute payments, negotiated with both the Huns and various Gothic groups, served as a cost-effective alternative to sustained campaigns in the Balkans. This approach leveraged the East's comparatively robust tax base, which remained anchored in the densely urbanized provinces of Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt. Records preserved in the Codex Theodosianus indicate systematic collection of levies and the allocation of resources for frontier maintenance. The strategic use of federate troops, barbarian contingents incorporated into the army under Roman command, allowed the Eastern military to augment its forces without overextending central units. Military administration during this period emphasized flexibility and regional specialization. Field armies, comitatenses, operated under experienced generals, capable of rapid response to Gothic movements, while limitanii units garrisoned towns, river crossings. While mountain passes, the Eastern Command also prioritized intelligence gathering and early warning networks along the Danube and in Thrace. Reports in contemporary chronicles note that Constantinople itself maintained a standing garrison larger than most Western cities could support, supplemented by a chain of signal towers and cavalry patrols. The Theodosian walls, completed in the early 5th century, combined layered fortifications, massive stone construction, and controlled access points, creating a defensive depth that deterred direct assault. Alaric's campaigns, culminating in the sack of Rome in 410 CE, underscored the differences between East and West. Whereas the Western Empire struggled with internal decay, fiscal insolvency, and military fragmentation, the East maintained coherent bureaucratic control and sustained strategic reserves. The Eastern perspective treated events in Italy as alarming but contained. Constantinople's survival depended on leveraging geography, fortification, and disciplined administration. Archaeological evidence from the period demonstrates ongoing urban investment in Anatolia and the Balkans, including repairs to city walls, bridges, and roads, ensuring secure supply lines for both civilian populations and military deployments. The Eastern emperors also faced the Huns under Attila, whose campaigns intensified in the 440s and 450s. Negotiations were as important as battlefield engagements. Theodosius II authorized payments and carefully managed diplomatic contacts, recognizing that the cost of direct confrontation with Hunnic forces could exceed available military resources. Surviving inscriptions and legal records illustrate the allocation of gold for tribute and the reinforcement of frontier settlements. In combination with previously established fortifications, these measures allowed the Eastern Empire to absorb pressure from nomadic incursions while maintaining internal order and economic stability. Administrative oversight further strengthened resilience. Pulcheria, sister of Theodosius II, played a significant role in sustaining governmental continuity during periods of minority rule. Her stewardship emphasized religious unity, efficient taxation, and support for urban centers. Urban archaeology from Constantinople and provincial capitals indicates continued investment in civic infrastructure, public baths, aqueducts, and marketplaces, demonstrating that the state maintained both military and civil capacity. These efforts contrasted sharply with the West, where declining revenues and elite fragmentation had undermined urban life. Economically, the East benefited from a denser network of cities, fertile hinterlands, and secure trade routes. Grain shipments from Egypt and the Levant ensured Constantinople's provisioning, while Anatolian production supported both military and civilian populations. Fiscal policy, recorded in the Codex Theodosianus, emphasized regularized taxation and anti-corruption measures, enabling long-term financial planning for frontier defense and imperial projects. By integrating military, diplomatic, and economic strategies, the Eastern Empire could survive shocks that would have been catastrophic elsewhere. By the mid-5th century, these combined policies had achieved a remarkable outcome. The East maintained territorial integrity, protected key cities, and stabilized internal governance despite continuous external threats. Alaric's campaigns and the Hunnic pressures served as stress tests, confirming the efficacy of Constantinople's fortifications, the administrative apparatus, and the strategic deployment of resources. Contemporary chroniclers consistently note that the East avoided the systemic collapse that defined the Western Empire's final decades. Having survived external pressures, the East turned inward to strengthen its institutions. Administrative continuity, fiscal discipline, and urban investment laid the foundation for a resilient Eastern state capable of both defending its frontiers and projecting authority across the Mediterranean for the centuries to come. In the 5th century, law became one of Byzantium's most enduring tools of stability. When Theodosius II assumed authority over the Eastern Empire in 408 CE, he inherited a state that had survived decades of external threat but faced significant internal challenges. The young emperor's early reign, guided initially by his sister Pulcheria and senior advisors, emphasized institutional consolidation and administrative continuity. One of his most enduring achievements was the Codex Theodosianus, completed in 438 CE. This codification represented the first systematic compilation of imperial legislation since Constantine, organizing centuries of edicts, rescripts, and legal pronouncements into a coherent framework. Its structure divided laws according to thematic and administrative categories, covering everything from civil and criminal codes to ecclesiastical regulations. Scholars note that the Codex not only preserved legal tradition but also provided a model for subsequent Byzantine law, influencing governance for generations. The codification process was a complex administrative undertaking. Imperial clerks and jurists worked to reconcile contradictory statutes, eliminate obsolete provisions, and standardize terminology. Surviving prefaces and inscriptions emphasized the role of Constantinople as the administrative hub for these efforts. The Codex made law transparent to officials across the empire, reinforcing centralized authority while facilitating consistent implementation at provincial levels. By providing clear legal guidance, the Theodosian Code strengthened the bureaucracy, which was increasingly staffed by professionals, including eunuchs who played vital roles in palace administration and court hierarchy. Eunuchs often supervised key offices, combining loyalty, administrative skill, and insulation from dynastic ambitions, thus contributing to political stability. Simultaneously, Theodosius II invested in urban and ceremonial infrastructure. The construction of the Theodosian walls between 412 and 414 CE transformed Constantinople into one of the most defensible cities in the Mediterranean. These fortifications, composed of double stone walls with integrated towers and gates, allowed the city to withstand sieges for centuries. Archaeological studies confirm that the walls incorporated previous Hellenistic and Roman fortifications while extending the city's perimeter to accommodate population growth. Beyond military function, the walls also reinforced imperial authority, symbolically delineating the sacred space of the capital and the protective role of the emperor. Education and intellectual life also received imperial attention. Theodosius II established schools emphasizing rhetoric, law, and classical learning, ensuring a steady supply of educated administrators. These institutions complemented the codification of law by preparing officials capable of interpreting and implementing complex statutes. Papyri and inscriptions from Constantinople indicate that graduates often entered the imperial bureaucracy or served in provincial administrations, demonstrating the practical integration of education with governance. Religious policy remained a central component of Theodosius' administration. The emperor navigated complex theological disputes, notably the Nestorian and Monophysite controversies, which threatened both doctrinal unity and political stability. Council decisions, episcopal appointments, and imperial edicts reflected the growing intertwining of church and state. The Theodosian Code codified not only secular law but also regulations concerning ecclesiastical hierarchy, heresy, and the rights of bishops, formalizing the empire's role as arbiter of religious orthodoxy. This legal integration reinforced Constantinople's position as both political and spiritual center of the East. Court ceremonial evolved alongside administrative and religious centralization. The hierarchy of offices expanded, and public rituals emphasized the emperor's supreme authority. Ceremonial positions, intricate protocols, and palace etiquette structured interactions between officials, clergy, and foreign envoys. Contemporary accounts describe processions, audiences, and investitures that reinforced loyalty while projecting imperial power. Material evidence from the Great Palace District, including audience halls and administrative suites, illustrates the physical spaces in which these ceremonies were performed, linking architectural design with bureaucratic and symbolic functions. Fiscal stability underpinned these achievements. The East maintained a robust tax base drawn from urban centers, agricultural production, and trade networks, funding fortifications, educational initiatives, and administrative salaries. This economic strength, combined with legal codification and ceremonial consolidation, produced a resilient state apparatus capable of addressing both internal and external challenges. Unlike the West, which struggled with fragmented authority and declining resources, the Eastern Empire leveraged law as a tool of continuity, ensuring that governance remained predictable, enforceable, and insulated from ephemeral political pressures. By integrating codified law, fortified urban centers, a professionalized bureaucracy, and strategic oversight of religious institutions, Theodosius II created the structural foundations of Byzantine administration. The Codex Theodosianus, in particular, offered a durable legal framework that guided imperial action, provincial governance. and ecclesiastical relations for decades. These reforms reinforced the distinction between the East and the faltering West, demonstrating that institutional resilience could compensate for ongoing military threats and demographic pressures. These foundations prepared the empire for its most ambitious ruler since Constantine, Justinian. By the early 6th century, the empire was wealthy, fortified, and poised for expansion. When Anastasius I ascended to the throne in 491 CE, he inherited an Eastern empire that had survived centuries of external pressure but required structural strengthening. The administrative and fiscal systems left by predecessors provided a foundation, yet decades of military expenditure, religious disputes, and inefficient taxation had created latent vulnerabilities. Anastasius recognized that long-term stability demanded both economic reform and strategic defense, and his reign became a defining period of institutional consolidation. Central to his achievements was fiscal reform. Anastasius inherited a treasury burdened by irregular revenue collection and heavy military obligations. Through systematic review of taxation, he streamlined provincial levies, enforced stricter compliance, and abolished unnecessary exemptions. Coinage reform complemented these policies. He introduced a stable copper phallus, standardizing circulation and facilitating everyday commerce. Numismatic evidence, including surviving examples from Constantinople and provincial mints, demonstrates the wide adoption of these new denominations. By the end of his reign, the imperial treasury reportedly held a surplus exceeding 2 million solidi, a remarkable figure reflecting both disciplined administration and sustained economic growth. This financial stability underpinned subsequent military and infrastructural initiatives, illustrating how fiscal prudence directly enabled state security and expansion. Military organization also received significant attention. Anastasius undertook a comprehensive restructuring of frontier defenses, emphasizing both mobility and endurance. He constructed and reinforced the long walls of Constantinople, extending from the city to the Sea of Marmara, to protect landward approaches from Thrace. Archaeological investigations reveal the wall's sophisticated construction, combining stone ramparts, towers, and integrated gates, reflecting lessons learned from previous Gothic and Hunnic incursions. Beyond the capital, frontier fortresses were reinforced along the Danube and in the eastern provinces bordering the Sasanian Empire. These installations allowed the Eastern military to respond to incursions effectively without relying solely on central field armies, preserving strategic flexibility. Anastasius also engaged diplomatically with neighboring powers, notably the Sasanian Empire. While large-scale conflict was avoided during most of his reign, minor border skirmishes and negotiated settlements required careful coordination of military and fiscal resources. The emperor's ability to maintain peace without overextending armies exemplifies the strategic integration of diplomacy, finance, and military preparedness. Contemporary chroniclers, including John Malalas, highlight that these measures not only defended the empire's borders, but also signaled Constantinople's growing political resilience and sophistication in frontier management. Religious policy under Anastasius remained a source of internal challenge. The emperor himself adhered to Miaphysite Christianity, a position at odds with Chalcedonian orthodoxy in much of the bureaucracy and urban centers. Disputes over ecclesiastical appointments occasionally erupted into civil unrest, particularly in Constantinople. Anastasius' approach combined legal measures, strategic appointments, and selective tolerance, seeking to preserve both civic order and imperial authority. Surviving passages in the Chronican Paschal and entries in the Theodosian Code indicate that administrative attention to religious tensions was integral to maintaining fiscal and military stability, rather than a purely theological concern. The economic and military initiatives of Anastasius had long-term consequences for the Eastern Empire. The secure financial base allowed for continuous funding of fortifications, salaries, and public works, and restructured military deployments improved responsiveness to both internal revolts and external threats. Urban archaeology from Constantinople and provincial capitals demonstrates simultaneous investment in civic infrastructure, including aqueducts, roads, and marketplaces, further enhancing the resilience of imperial governance. These developments collectively illustrate the pragmatic interplay between economy, defense, and administration, a combination that would later enable ambitious military campaigns. Anastasius' reign also reinforced the centrality of Constantinople as the empire's political, economic, and symbolic hub. The fortified capital served as both a secure residence for the emperor and a command center for provincial administration. Its defensive upgrades, combined with a reliable supply of revenue and a professionalized bureaucracy, ensured that Constantinople could withstand sieges or rebellions without destabilizing the broader empire. By positioning the capital as the anchor of imperial control, Anastasius laid the groundwork for the operational and logistical requirements of expansive campaigns that would characterize Justinian's reign. By the end of his rule in 518 CE, Anastasius had transformed the Eastern Empire into a state that was financially solvent, militarily fortified, and administratively efficient. His policies stabilized internal governance, secured frontiers, and prepared Constantinople for its role as the center of Eastern Roman power. The combination of economic surplus, strategic defense, and controlled religious integration created the conditions necessary for the ambitious projects of his successors, demonstrating the practical importance of methodical institutional consolidation. With strong finances and a secure capital, Justinian entered history. By the 530s, Justinian sought nothing less than the restoration of Roman order across the Mediterranean. Justinian I ascended the Eastern Roman throne in 527 CE, inheriting an empire that had been stabilized financially and militarily by predecessors but remained territorially limited. From the outset, he pursued an ambitious agenda: centralize authority, codify law, and reclaim lost Roman territories. These objectives were mutually reinforcing. Effective reconquest depended not only on military capability but also on a coherent administrative apparatus capable of mobilizing resources, collecting revenue, and enforcing imperial authority in newly acquired regions. Central to Justinian's vision was legal reform. Roman law had accumulated inconsistencies, contradictions, and regional variations over centuries. The emperor commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, completed between 529 and 534 CE, a comprehensive codification that included the Codex Justinianus, the Digest, the Institutes, and the Novelli. The Codex consolidated prior imperial legislation, while the Digest synthesized jurists' opinions. The Institutes provided a structured educational framework for legal professionals, and the Novelli introduced new legislation during Justinian's reign. Together, these works standardized jurisprudence across the empire, enhanced bureaucratic efficiency, and projected imperial authority into all corners of governance. Surviving manuscripts and inscriptions confirm their widespread use in Constantinople and provincial courts, illustrating the practical reach of Justinianic legal centralization. Administrative restructuring complemented these legal reforms. Justinian reorganized provincial governance to reduce corruption, improve efficiency, and consolidate imperial oversight. Prefects, governors, and other officials were subjected to stricter supervision, and new auditing procedures ensured accountability in revenue collection. The Praetorian prefects became central nodes in this system, coordinating fiscal, judicial, and logistical operations across multiple provinces. Textual evidence from the Novelli records reforms aimed at curbing malfeasance, including penalties for embezzlement and administrative negligence, demonstrating an active commitment to institutional integrity. The court also played a critical role in Justinian's consolidation. Empress Theodora exercised significant political influence, particularly during crises. Her involvement in policy formation, judicial appointments, and ceremonial representation not only strengthened imperial cohesion, but also enhanced the legitimacy of central authority. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Procopius, document her interventions during legal disputes, religious controversies, and political crises, revealing how Theodora's influence complemented Justinian's administrative objectives. Her presence in court ceremonial reinforced the ideological unity of the regime and underscored the integration of imperial household and state apparatus. A defining moment in Justinian's early reign was the Nika Revolt of 532 CE. Triggered by factional tensions in the Hippodrome and widespread discontent among Constantinople's population, the revolt escalated into an open challenge to imperial authority. Analysis of primary sources indicates that the uprising was both social and political, reflecting grievances over taxation, corruption, and urban management. Justinian's response combined military decisiveness with strategic diplomacy. Loyal troops suppressed the rebellion, while targeted negotiations, including Theodora's reputed council, ensured that the emperor retained the loyalty of key factions. The revolt's suppression enabled the reconstruction of major public works, most notably the Hagia Sophia, which became a symbol of imperial authority, architectural innovation, and religious centrality. Archaeological and architectural studies confirm that Justinian leveraged the rebuilding of Constantinople as both a practical and ideological tool, consolidating internal control while projecting power outward. Bureaucratic and urban reforms were inseparable from Justinian's strategic ambitions. Strengthened provincial administration, secure revenue streams, and centralized legal authority provided the necessary infrastructure for military expeditions. The reorganization of supply chains, urban provisioning, and frontier management ensured that campaigns in North Africa and Italy could be launched with logistical reliability. Contemporary accounts emphasize that Justinian's domestic measures were not purely ceremonial or symbolic. They were instrumental in enabling territorial reconquest. Equally significant was the ideological dimension of administrative centralization. Justinian presented himself as the restorer of Roman order, a ruler whose authority encompassed legal, military, and religious domains. The integration of Christian orthodoxy into imperial policy reinforced social cohesion, while ceremonial innovations in the court articulated a hierarchy in which loyalty, service, while obedience were visually and legally codified. These measures created a governance system capable of sustaining prolonged military and fiscal endeavors, demonstrating the interplay between law, bureaucracy, and ideology. By the end of this period, Justinian's consolidation had established a highly centralized and resilient state. Legal codification provided uniformity, administrative restructuring ensured accountability, ceremonial and ideological frameworks reinforced loyalty and legitimacy, and the suppression of internal dissent, exemplified by the Nika Revolt, proved the effectiveness of centralized authority. Collectively, these reforms enabled the empire to operate as a coordinated and cohesive entity, capable of projecting power beyond its immediate borders. With internal structures strengthened, Justinian redirected imperial energies toward reclaiming lost territories. In less than 2 decades, Eastern armies marched across Africa, Sicily, and Italy in pursuit of a restored Roman Mediterranean. Justinian's reconquest campaigns relied on a combination of visionary strategy, skilled generals, and the centralized resources established during his early reign. The first major expedition, the Vandalic War of 533 to 534 CE, targeted North Africa, then under the control of the Vandal kingdom. Led by the general Belisarius, the campaign was swift and decisive. The Vandals, weakened by internal political divisions and underestimating Byzantine military capacity, were defeated at the Battle of Ad Decimum near Carthage and later at Tricamarum. Contemporary sources, particularly Procopius in Wars, describe the effective coordination of naval and land forces, the disciplined deployment of infantry and cavalry, and the integration of federate contingents, demonstrating the operational flexibility of the Eastern Army. Following victory, Carthage was restored as a key administrative and logistical center, and imperial governance was re-established with careful attention to taxation, legal frameworks, and local elites, reflecting the broader objective of sustainable territorial reintegration. Encouraged by success in Africa, Justinian turned to Italy, initiating the Gothic War, 535 to 554 CE. Belisarius again led the initial campaigns, capturing Sicily and advancing to the Italian mainland. However, the protracted nature of warfare soon became apparent. Italy's geography, from the Apennine Mountains to fortified urban centers, posed significant logistical challenges. Procopius documents extensive sieges of key cities, including Naples, Rome, and Ravenna, emphasizing the coordination of supply lines, the use of siege engines, and the management of multi-ethnic armies. Byzantine forces included regular units, federate troops, and naval contingents, highlighting the empire's reliance on a complex, integrated military system. Despite early victories, Gothic resistance proved resilient, and intermittent counterattacks slowed progress. The war in Italy also placed extraordinary strain on imperial finances. Maintaining distant armies, provisioning sieges, and replacing losses required sustained fiscal input. Archaeological evidence, including coin hoards and records of grain shipments, confirms the extensive economic demands of the campaigns. Justinian's centralized treasury and taxation systems, refined under predecessors and his own administration, allowed the empire to sustain operations over 2 decades. Nevertheless, the prolonged conflict exposed limits in manpower, supply, and the ability to simultaneously manage frontier defense in the Balkans and along the Danube. Following Belisarius' initial campaigns, the general Narses assumed command during the later stages of the Gothic War. A unique and capable administrator, Narses brought meticulous planning to the final reconquest of Italy. He utilized large infantry formations, strategic fortifications, and coordinated cavalry movements to defeat remaining Gothic forces decisively. The culmination of these efforts was the recapture of Ravenna in 540 CE and the final victory at the Battle of Mons Lactarius in 552 CE, effectively ending organized Gothic resistance. Procopius' accounts highlight the careful integration of intelligence, reconnaissance, and supply management, underscoring the operational sophistication of late Byzantine campaigns. The military reconquests were accompanied by deliberate administrative integration. In North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, Justinian implemented provincial structures consistent with imperial norms. Civil governors, fiscal officers, and judicial authorities were appointed to enforce law and collect revenue. And local elites were co-opted to ensure cooperation. The Pragmatic Sanction of 554 CE codified these measures, formalizing administrative divisions, tax obligations, and legal procedures across reconquered territories. This act illustrates that Justinian's campaigns were not merely martial endeavors but carefully planned extensions of imperial governance, designed to secure long-term control rather than temporary occupation. The campaigns, while temporarily restoring Roman authority in the Western Mediterranean, also revealed the structural pressures inherent in expansion. Italian infrastructure suffered extensively. Cities were besieged repeatedly, agricultural production was disrupted, and populations experienced displacement. Byzantine administration had to address reconstruction, resource allocation, and social stabilization, all while sustaining frontier defense in the east. Contemporary chronicles note persistent unrest and fiscal complaints in newly acquired regions, emphasizing the dual challenge of military conquest and post-war governance. By 562 CE, the Eastern Empire had achieved remarkable territorial recovery. North Africa, Sicily, and Italy were nominally reintegrated into imperial structures with law, taxation, and administrative norms restored. However, the campaigns exacted a heavy toll in manpower, wealth, and urban stability. Procopius' detailed narratives, combined with archaeological surveys of fortifications and urban centers, underscore the scale of logistical coordination and the intensity of warfare, illustrating the sophisticated but costly nature of Justinianic expansion. Yet even at the height of Justinian's success, new structural pressures emerged, beginning with a catastrophic pandemic. In 541 CE, an unforeseen biological crisis halted the machinery of imperial expansion. The first recorded outbreak of the Justinianic plague struck Constantinople in 541 CE, rapidly spreading across the eastern Mediterranean and reaching Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Contemporary chroniclers, most notably Procopius in History of the Wars, describe fever, buboes, and high mortality rates that overwhelmed urban populations. Archaeological and bioarchaeological studies, including DNA analysis of skeletal remains, confirm the presence of Yersinia pestis, demonstrating that this pandemic was a significant epidemiological event with profound social and economic consequences. The plague decimated Constantinople's population, with estimates suggesting mortality rates as high as 25 to 50% in the capital alone, severely reducing available labor for agriculture, construction, and administration. The demographic shock had immediate fiscal repercussions. Reduced population meant diminished tax revenues, which strained the imperial treasury at a time when Justinian was financing both ongoing military campaigns and extensive urban reconstruction projects. The plague coincided with recurrent famines and localized crop failures, further limiting the state's ability to collect resources. Papyrological evidence from Egypt and inscriptions from Asia Minor show interruptions in tax collection and recorded payments in kind, reflecting the administrative adaptation required to maintain fiscal solvency under extreme demographic stress. Military recruitment was also critically affected. The Eastern Army, already stretched thin by campaigns in Italy and North Africa, faced shortages in both manpower and experienced officers. Federate contingents and provincial levies were insufficient to sustain frontier garrisons, particularly along the Danube and eastern Anatolian borders. This vulnerability emboldened external adversaries, including the Sasanian Empire, which took advantage of weakened Byzantine defenses to engage in border raids and intermittent warfare. Procopius details skirmishes in Mesopotamia and Armenia, emphasizing how the empire had to negotiate defensive priorities under the dual pressures of demographic loss and territorial overextension. The plague's effects extended into urban and rural life, disrupting trade, industry, and labor-intensive public works. Constantinople's construction projects slowed, while provincial cities faced labor shortages that affected local economies. Archaeological evidence indicates that some urban centers experienced partial abandonment, reduced maintenance of fortifications, and interrupted infrastructure repairs. These disruptions compounded the fiscal strain, making it increasingly difficult for the empire to sustain both administrative and military commitments in reconquered regions of Italy and North Africa. Natural disasters amplified these structural limits. Earthquakes in Antioch 526 CE and other eastern provinces had already caused widespread destruction, and subsequent seismic activity during Justinian's reign further damaged urban and rural settlements. Combined with famine, disease, and the costs of long-term warfare, these events revealed the empire's vulnerability to cumulative shocks. Historical analyses suggest that such environmental and epidemiological factors constrained imperial capacity, forcing a reevaluation of expansionist ambitions in favor of strategic consolidation. Despite these challenges, Justinian continued to assert imperial authority. Efforts to reorganize military command, replenish treasury reserves, and maintain urban administration illustrate a pragmatic response to systemic crisis. Legal and fiscal adjustments, including relief measures for affected populations and temporary tax exemptions, mitigated some social pressures. However, these measures could not fully compensate for the demographic and economic disruptions, highlighting the limits of centralized administration in the face of large-scale biological and environmental crises. By the end of Justinian's reign in 565 CE, the empire had retained its reconquered territories but at significant cost. Italy, North Africa, and the Balkans required ongoing reconstruction and garrisoning, and frontier zones remained vulnerable. The plague, combined with prolonged military expenditure, famine, and seismic disasters, forced a transition from ambitious territorial restoration toward careful strategic retrenchment. Contemporary chroniclers and modern historians alike emphasize that the late Justinianic period was defined less by expansion than by the management of structural limits, demographic, economic, and environmental, that constrained imperial capacity. As the empire entered the later 6th century, it faced mounting external pressure and internal transformation. The lessons of the plague, fiscal overextension, and frontier vulnerability would shape Byzantine policy, administration, and military strategy for decades, setting the stage for defensive adaptation under Justinian's successors. By the early 7th century, the empire fought a war that stretched its resources to the breaking point. The final major conflict between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persians, beginning in 572 CE and concluding in 628 CE, marked a period of extreme military, fiscal, and administrative strain. Initiated under Emperor Justin II and continued under Tiberius II and Maurice, the war was fueled by long-standing territorial disputes over Mesopotamia and Armenia, as well as competing claims to influence in the Levant. Byzantine forces faced a determined and resourceful adversary in Khosrow II, whose campaigns leveraged Persia's military traditions and logistics. Contemporary chronicles, including those by Theophylact Simocatta, detail prolonged sieges, multi-year campaigns, and significant territorial oscillation, emphasizing the immense pressure on both manpower and imperial coffers. The fall of Jerusalem in 614 CE represented a severe blow. The Sasanian army captured the city after a brief but intense siege, seizing the true cross according to Byzantine sources. The loss had religious, political, and economic repercussions. It undermined morale, disrupted pilgrimage routes, and created administrative vacuums in key provinces. Byzantine resistance persisted, but the empire's eastern defenses were stretched thin, with troops divided across multiple fronts from Mesopotamia to Anatolia. Fiscal records indicate increased taxation and mobilization of provincial resources, highlighting the empire's dependence on administrative efficiency to sustain prolonged conflict. The accession of Heraclius in 610 CE marked a turning point in the war. Despite inheriting an empire under severe duress, Heraclius implemented a strategic reorganization of military command and logistics. He personally led campaigns into the Persian heartland, employing combined arms tactics, rapid maneuver, and coordinated naval operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Procopius and later chroniclers provide detailed accounts of his campaigns, emphasizing adaptability in the face of resource limitations and the importance of intelligence and supply lines. Over the course of 622 to 627 CE, Heraclius achieved a series of decisive victories, culminating in the Battle of Nineveh, 627 CE, which effectively broke Persian resistance. The Byzantine victory in 628 CE was both remarkable and Pyrrhic. Persia collapsed internally, and Khosrow II was overthrown, yet the prolonged war had exhausted Byzantine resources. Population losses from decades of prior conflict, plague, and famine were compounded by fiscal depletion, disruption of agricultural production, and damage to urban infrastructure. Procopius and later chronicles emphasize that although the empire had survived, its capacity for sustained offensive operations was severely diminished. Strategically, the war underscored the limitations of late Roman military and administrative systems when applied to large-scale, multi-front campaigns. Heraclius' success relied heavily on centralized control, personal leadership, and improvisation in the face of logistical constraints. It also revealed the importance of provincial resilience. Anatolian and Levantine cities, fortified during Justinianic and subsequent administrations, served as critical supply bases, allowing Heraclius to project force into Mesopotamia despite systemic stress. Politically, the war strengthened imperial authority but exposed vulnerabilities. Heraclius' centralization of command, direct oversight of provincial governors, and manipulation of aristocratic loyalties consolidated power at Constantinople, yet reliance on local militias, foederati, and provincial elites highlighted structural fragility. The prolonged absence of imperial forces in certain regions permitted localized revolts and administrative breakdowns, necessitating later reforms to enhance resilience and local defense. The victory over Persia demonstrated the Byzantine Empire's capacity for recovery under capable leadership, yet it came at the cost of weakened military reserves, depleted treasuries, and a demoralized population. Strategic gains in territory and prestige were fragile, as subsequent external pressures would test the empire's endurance. The lessons learned regarding supply mobilization and provincial reliance would inform Heraclius' later military and administrative policies, including preliminary steps toward the thematic system, which sought to integrate military and civil authority at the regional level. The war also had profound religious and ideological implications. The retrieval of the true cross and the framing of Heraclius as divinely guided reinforced the role of imperial ideology in sustaining morale during protracted conflict. Ecclesiastical networks, including patriarchal and monastic institutions, played key roles in provisioning armies, mediating local unrest, and maintaining the social fabric, illustrating the interplay between religious authority and imperial governance in times of crisis. The victory over Persia proved short-lived as new forces emerged from Arabia. Within a few years, the Arabian Peninsula became the launching point for a series of rapid, transformative conquests that would challenge the territorial integrity and administrative structures of the Byzantine state in ways the Sasanian Wars had not. In a single generation, the empire lost its richest provinces. Following the death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, the newly unified Arab tribes launched a series of military campaigns that rapidly expanded the reach of the nascent Islamic state. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by decades of protracted warfare with Persia, recurrent plagues, and internal fiscal strain, confronted a highly motivated and mobile adversary. Initial clashes in the Levant exposed vulnerabilities in the empire's eastern frontier. Byzantine forces, organized under regional commanders with provincial militias, struggled to respond to the speed and cohesion of the Arab armies. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE proved decisive. Byzantine sources, including Theophanes and later chroniclers, record the deployment of combined infantry and cavalry units under Emperor Heraclius' generals. Despite numerical superiority, Byzantine forces suffered from logistical limitations, fractured command structures, and exhaustion from prior conflicts. Arab forces employing rapid maneuver coordinated attacks and flexible tribal contingents overwhelmed Byzantine lines, resulting in catastrophic losses. The defeat at Yarmouk effectively ended Byzantine control over Syria and set a precedent for subsequent campaigns in Palestine and Transjordan. In Egypt, the Arab advance continued between 639 and 642 CE. Byzantine garrisons, reliant on fortified cities such as Alexandria and local militia levies, mounted resistance but were gradually isolated and defeated. The conquest of Egypt deprived the empire of its primary grain supply, critical fiscal revenue, and one of its most prosperous provinces. Papyrological evidence from the Nile Delta documents disruptions in taxation and urban administration, illustrating the rapid collapse of local bureaucratic structures under military pressure. The loss of Egypt not only constrained Constantinople's fiscal capacity, but also undermined the empire's strategic depth in the eastern Mediterranean. Administrative collapse accompanied military defeat. Provincial governors often fled or were killed, and centralized communication between Constantinople and frontier regions was disrupted. Chroniclers note that local elites were co-opted by Arab administrators to maintain order and revenue collection, demonstrating both the practical necessity of adaptive governance and the limits of Byzantine authority in newly conquered territories. Urban centers, previously fortified and economically productive, were repurposed under new administrative arrangements, illustrating how conquest precipitated structural transformation in formerly Byzantine regions. The empire's response relied increasingly on frontier reorganization and regional adaptation. Remaining provinces were consolidated, garrisons restructured, and defensive priorities shifted to Anatolia, the Aegean, and the eastern Mediterranean islands. Military settlement patterns began to foreshadow the thematic system, integrating landholding and military obligations to create self-sufficient defensive units. Archaeological surveys of fortifications in Cappadocia, Asia Minor, and the Aegean confirm the construction of new defensive works, repair of city walls, and the establishment of watchtowers, reflecting a systematic approach to territorial contraction. Economically, the loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt necessitated a recalibration of imperial fiscal policy. The treasury faced a reduction in agricultural revenue, trade tariffs, and urban taxes. The Byzantine administration increasingly relied on surviving Anatolian provinces, trade with the Balkans, and maritime commerce to sustain the state apparatus. Coinage evidence from Constantinople and provincial mints demonstrates attempts to stabilize currency and maintain the flow of resources for both military and civilian needs. Religious and social networks also played a role in the transition. Ecclesiastical institutions, monastic communities, and local elites were often enlisted to facilitate continuity of administration, provide intelligence, and maintain morale. The Byzantine state leveraged these structures to stabilize remaining territories and to propagate ideological cohesion despite territorial loss. These efforts highlight the empire's ability to adapt governance mechanisms even as it faced unprecedented contraction. By 700 CE, the empire had lost its richest provinces, fundamentally altering the scale, fiscal capacity, and strategic orientation of the state. The rapidity of the Arab conquests revealed the limits of traditional provincial administration and underscored the necessity for structural innovation. The empire's survival now depended less on territorial expansion than on the ability to integrate military, fiscal, and administrative systems within a more compact and defensible footprint. These losses forced structural innovation within the shrinking empire. From crisis emerged a new system of provincial defense. By the mid-7th century, the Byzantine Empire faced an existential challenge. The rapid losses of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of North Africa to the expanding Arab Caliphate exposed vulnerabilities in both frontier defense and centralized administration. Traditional Roman provincial structures, reliant on distant governors and itinerant field armies, proved insufficient to respond to highly mobile, opportunistic enemies. In response, the empire initiated a transformative administrative and military reform that came to be known as the thematic system, or the Mata. The thematic system reorganized the empire into regional military districts, each responsible for its own defense and governance. Initially, these districts were concentrated in Anatolia, the empire's remaining core territory. Each theme was led by a strategos, a commander who exercised combined civil and military authority. This integration reflected lessons from the prior decades. Local commanders needed autonomy to respond rapidly to raids, while maintaining accountability to Constantinople. Textual evidence from 7th and 8th century chroniclers, alongside administrative documents, indicates that themes were subdivided into smaller units, enabling a layered defensive posture that balanced mobility with territorial coverage. A defining feature of the thematic system was the integration of land and military service. Soldier farmers, known as stratiotai, were granted plots of land in exchange for military obligations. This arrangement ensured that troops were locally rooted, self-sufficient, and immediately available for defense, and simultaneously sustaining the rural economy. Archaeological surveys across western and central Anatolia reveal remnants of fortified settlements and agrarian layouts consistent with this dual-use approach, confirming the operational implementation of the system. By embedding military capacity within the social and economic fabric of the provinces, the empire reduced reliance on distant logistics and professional field armies, which had been vulnerable to overextension. Administrative decentralization accompanied military reform. While the emperor and central bureaucracy in Constantinople retained ultimate authority over taxation, legislation, and strategic coordination, thematic governors exercised considerable autonomy in day-to-day governance. They collected local taxes, managed garrison provisions, adjudicated minor disputes, and coordinated fortification projects. This decentralization allowed the empire to respond efficiently to incursions along extensive frontiers, while preserving central oversight for larger strategic initiatives, such as fleet deployments and diplomatic negotiations. The system thus represented a pragmatic balance between local initiative and imperial control. Thematic reorganization also influenced urban planning and fortification strategies. Cities and fortified towns became nodes in a defensive network, with coordinated watchtowers, garrison settlements, and fortified roads enabling rapid communication and troop movement. Material evidence, including excavated city walls, rural forts, and inscriptions identifying local strategoi, corroborates the textual accounts of the time. These structures enhanced the empire's resilience, allowing it to absorb raids, conduct counterstrikes, and maintain internal order despite external pressures. Economically, the thematic system linked taxation with military capacity. Soldiers' landholdings provided both subsistence and a mechanism for revenue collection, reducing the financial burden on the central treasury. The state maintained oversight to prevent overconcentration of power among local commanders, ensuring that fiscal and military resources remained aligned with imperial objectives. This adaptive model enabled the Byzantine Empire to sustain defense and administration even as its territorial base contracted significantly from the 7th century conquests. Socially and politically, the thematic system fostered closer integration between provincial populations and military obligations. Local communities participated in defense planning, provisioning, and garrison service, creating a sense of shared responsibility for survival. Chroniclers note that loyalty to the empire became increasingly grounded in regional affiliation, military service, and tangible benefits of land tenure, rather than purely ceremonial allegiance to the distant emperor. This localization of authority and investment strengthened internal cohesion, providing the empire with a durable buffer against both external attack and internal dissent. By 700 CE, the thematic system had emerged as a cornerstone of Byzantine resilience. It stabilized Anatolia, enabled the empire to maintain military readiness with limited resources, and facilitated rapid response to Arab raids along remaining eastern and southern frontiers. The combination of military, fiscal, and administrative integration allowed the empire not merely to survive but to preserve the institutional continuity of the Roman state within a significantly reduced territorial footprint. These adaptations set the stage for the next century of Byzantine governance. By the early 8th century, themes and their associated structures enabled the empire to weather new ideological and military challenges, including the onset of iconoclastic controversies, renewed Arab assaults, and evolving relations with European neighbors, laying the groundwork for a period of defensive consolidation and strategic stabilization. In the 8th century, images became the center of imperial policy. The accession of Leo III the Isaurian in 717 CE coincided with one of the most critical periods in Byzantine history. The empire faced existential military threats, most immediately the advancing Umayyad Caliphate. The siege of Constantinople, 717 to 718 CE, tested the empire's defensive capacity to its limits. Utilizing the fortifications of the Theodosian walls, the strategic advantage of the city's geography, and the innovative use of Greek fire in naval engagements, Leo successfully repelled the besieging forces. Contemporary accounts, including those preserved in the chronicles of Theophanes the Confessor, emphasize the combination of military ingenuity, centralized command, and logistical planning that allowed the city to endure a prolonged siege. This victory secured Constantinople as the enduring heart of the empire and reinforced the authority of the Isaurian dynasty. In the aftermath of the siege, Leo III implemented administrative reforms to strengthen the empire's resilience. He reinforced frontier defenses, particularly in Anatolia and the Balkans, reorganized military command structures, and ensured a more efficient system of provincial governance. Fiscal adjustments were enacted to maintain garrison readiness and support both civilian and military infrastructure. These measures demonstrate a continuity of strategic pragmatism reminiscent of prior Byzantine rulers, linking defensive capability with administrative efficiency. Concurrently, Leo initiated a religious reform movement known as the First Iconoclasm. Beginning in 726 CE, he issued edicts opposing the veneration of religious images, arguing that such practices had provoked divine disfavor and invited military disasters, such as previous Arab incursions. The iconoclastic policy was enforced across the empire, including imperial patronage, liturgical changes, and legal directives against the production and public display of icons. Legal and administrative records indicate that ecclesiastical compliance was monitored by provincial governors, while resistance from monastic communities and urban elites occasionally prompted targeted enforcement measures. These reforms exemplify how theological policy was intimately connected with the exercise of imperial authority, influencing both religious practice and political governance. The iconoclastic policy also had implications for imperial legitimacy and court politics. By asserting authority over religious imagery, Leo centralized ideological control, reinforcing the emperor's position as the ultimate arbiter of both civil and spiritual matters. The policy aligned with broader administrative reforms, as religious and military compliance became intertwined with loyalty to the state. Chroniclers note that the enforcement of iconoclasm helped to consolidate provincial and urban obedience, particularly in Anatolia, which functioned as the empire's primary defensive and economic base. The Isaurian reforms extended beyond theology into military and economic stabilization. Leo III established more effective provincial tax collection, linking fiscal policy to garrison maintenance and frontier defense. The theme system, initiated in previous decades, was reinforced, integrating military obligations with land tenure and local administration. Urban centers received renewed attention for fortifications and provisioning, ensuring that cities could withstand external threats and support centralized governance. Archaeological evidence from Anatolian fortresses and urban centers corroborates this period of defensive consolidation and infrastructural investment. Leo's policies also influenced subsequent ecclesiastical debates. The enforcement of iconoclasm prompted both compliance and resistance within the church hierarchy, setting the stage for enduring conflicts between patriarchs, monastic communities, and imperial authority. These disputes were not solely theological but involved the allocation of wealth, administrative control, and political influence, illustrating how religious policy functioned as a key instrument of statecraft. By the end of Leo III's reign in 741 CE, the Byzantine Empire had achieved military stabilization, administrative reinforcement, and ideological consolidation. The defense of Constantinople, coupled with systematic provincial and thematic reforms, ensured the empire's survival against external pressures. Iconoclasm, while controversial, demonstrated the emperor's capacity to integrate religious policy with political and military objectives, shaping governance across multiple domains. The debates over images shaped the political climate of the next century. They influenced succession disputes, monastic resistance, and the broader trajectory of imperial authority, establishing patterns of interaction between theology, administration, and military strategy that would continue throughout the Isaurian and Macedonian periods. Defensive resilience became central to imperial strategy. Under the Isaurian dynasty, military reform was closely tied to the empire's need for sustainable defense against persistent external threats. Following the Arab sieges of the early 8th century, the Byzantine military confronted not only powerful caliphates but also recurring raids from Slavs, Bulgars, and other northern groups. Recognizing that large expeditionary armies were financially unsustainable, emperors such as Leo III and his successors increasingly emphasized the thematic armies as the core of imperial defense. These forces were organized regionally, drawing soldiers from the provinces in which they lived, combining local knowledge with long-term commitment to territorial security. The thematic system evolved during this period to include integrated land and frontier management. Soldiers were granted plots of land, stratiotic actimata, in return for military service, ensuring that they were both self-sufficient and immediately deployable. This arrangement allowed the empire to maintain readiness without overburdening the central treasury. Archaeological evidence from Anatolia, including fortified settlements and remnants of rural watch posts, confirms that these communities functioned as both productive agricultural units and defensive nodes. The combination of garrison towns and local militias increased operational flexibility, enabling rapid responses to incursions and reducing the likelihood of large-scale surprise attacks. Anatolian fortifications received systematic attention during this period. Strategic locations along the eastern and northern frontiers were reinforced, including passes through the Taurus Mountains and key river valleys. The repair and expansion of city walls, castles, and watchtowers created a network that allowed thematic armies to communicate and concentrate forces efficiently. Contemporary chronicles note that fortifications such as those at Amorium, Nicaea, and Adrianople not only delayed enemy advances but also served as centers for provincial administration and logistical coordination, demonstrating the dual military and bureaucratic function of defensive infrastructure. Military doctrine also adapted to these conditions. Whereas earlier Byzantine strategy relied heavily on large field armies and mobile cavalry, Isaurian reforms emphasized defense in depth, rapid regional mobilization, and flexible counterattacks. Commanders within the themes were granted authority to respond to raids without awaiting directives from Constantinople, while still remaining accountable to imperial oversight. The balance between autonomy and centralized coordination allowed for effective frontier management even under resource constraints, reflecting lessons learned from the devastating campaigns of the 7th century. The navy retained strategic significance as well, particularly in defending Constantinople and controlling the Aegean and Black Sea corridors. Greek fire, first effectively deployed during the Arab sieges, became a permanent feature of the Byzantine arsenal. Naval bases were integrated into broader thematic logistics, ensuring that coastal themes could both resist amphibious incursions and support inland operations. This combined arms approach, coordinating land and naval forces, enhanced the empire's overall defensive resilience. Economically, military reform was closely linked to fiscal stability. Soldiers' landholdings reduced the need for direct pay, while regional fortifications and settlements contributed to local economic activity. Supply chains for garrisons were managed within themes, minimizing dependence on long-distance transport and mitigating the impact of external disruption. Inscriptions and fiscal records indicate that this integration of military and economic structures allowed the empire to maintain a functional defense network despite contraction in territorial holdings and population pressures following the Arab conquests. Socially, the thematic system fostered closer ties between civilian populations and military structures. Local elites, clergy, and urban communities participated in provisioning, watchkeeping, and fortification maintenance. Loyalty to the empire became increasingly grounded in tangible obligations and protections rather than abstract authority, creating a durable model of civic-military integration. The success of these reforms under the Isaurians laid the foundation for the military resurgence and territorial reconsolidation that would characterize the Macedonian period. With improved security, the empire entered a period of cultural revival. Imperial policy shifted again as icons returned to state doctrine. The reign of Empress Irene, 780 to 802 CE, represents a pivotal moment in Byzantine political and religious history. Following decades of iconoclastic controversy under the Isaurian dynasty, Irene, acting initially as regent for her young son Constantine VI, sought to restore religious unity through the revival of icon veneration. Her policies were not purely theological. They were inseparable from the dynamics of imperial power, court factionalism, and the broader aim of consolidating authority at Constantinople. Contemporary chronicles, including those of Theophanes the Confessor, document both her strategic maneuvering within the palace and her engagement with ecclesiastical authorities to achieve these ends. Central to Irene's religious policy was the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 CE, convened under her auspices. The council formally condemned iconoclasm, restoring the veneration of icons as orthodox practice. Its canons addressed theological disputes, prescribing the proper use of images in liturgy and devotional life, while also affirming the emperor's role in enforcing doctrinal conformity. Written records from the council and subsequent correspondence indicate that Irene leveraged ecclesiastical consensus to strengthen her legitimacy, presenting herself as both a defender of orthodoxy and a stabilizing figure amid the political turbulence following decades of iconoclastic enforcement. Irene's restoration of icons had immediate political ramifications. She faced opposition from factions loyal to iconoclast traditions, particularly within military and bureaucratic elites who had prospered under earlier policies. The empress utilized a combination of administrative appointments, patronage, and, where necessary, coercion to secure compliance. Her consolidation of authority extended to the imperial court and the broader administrative apparatus, reinforcing the precedent that ideological policy could serve as a tool for centralizing power. The period also saw complex power struggles within the imperial family and bureaucracy. Irene's regency over Constantine VI initially required careful negotiation with aristocratic, military, and ecclesiastical stakeholders. Subsequent tensions culminated in Irene assuming sole rule, a rare occurrence of female sovereignty in Byzantine history. These developments illustrate how religious policy, succession politics, and bureaucratic control were deeply interlinked, with theological decisions directly affecting governance, loyalty, and the stability of the state. Administratively, Irene continued to strengthen the structures inherited from her Isaurian predecessors. Thematic armies remained central to frontier defense, while fiscal oversight and provincial governance were reinforced through strategic appointments and oversight mechanisms. Coinage evidence, inscriptions, and administrative documents from her reign indicate continuity in economic and bureaucratic organization, even as ideological shifts prompted localized disruptions. The integration of religious policy with governance ensured that loyalty to the state was reinforced through both material and ideological channels. Irene's reign also had significant diplomatic consequences. By restoring orthodoxy, she sought to secure legitimacy with Western powers, including the papacy, while negotiating peace and alliances along the empire's eastern and northern frontiers. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that her iconophile policies were used to justify her authority in the eyes of both internal elites and foreign rulers, demonstrating the practical utility of religious restoration as an instrument of statecraft. Despite these successes, Irene's rule was marked by persistent instability. Tensions with Constantine VI's internal court rivalries, and external pressures from Arab forces highlighted the fragility of centralized authority. Nevertheless, her restoration of icons re-established ideological cohesion and set the stage for a stabilized, centralized empire that could pursue military and cultural revival. Ecclesiastical networks, monastic communities, and provincial elites became partners in governance, reinforcing the integration of ideology and administration that characterized the later Byzantine state. These developments set the stage for the Macedonian ascendancy, a period beginning in the mid-9th century that would consolidate military, administrative, and cultural achievements. By resolving the iconoclastic controversies, Irene enabled her successors to focus on strategic frontier defense, internal reform, and the expansion of imperial authority, creating the conditions for the empire's resurgence in both territory and influence. Under Basil I, the empire reasserted administrative coherence. The accession of Basil I, 867 to 886 CE, marked the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, a period characterized by administrative consolidation, legal codification, and the stabilization of imperial authority after decades of political turbulence. Basil emerged from relatively modest origins, yet he leveraged both personal ambition and institutional reform to reinforce the central government. His reign focused on creating a durable administrative framework capable of sustaining military, fiscal, and bureaucratic functions across a geographically diverse empire. Central to Basil's domestic program was the codification and systematization of law. He oversaw the compilation of the Basilica, an extensive revision and reorganization of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, translated into Greek and adapted to contemporary administrative needs. The Basilica clarified legal procedure, updated imperial edicts, and harmonized civil and criminal law across the empire. By codifying legal norms, Basil provided both provincial governors and local magistrates with clear authority, reducing ambiguities that had previously hampered governance. Surviving manuscripts and scholia confirm the widespread use of the basilica in courts, administrative offices, and ecclesiastical institutions, highlighting its central role in reinforcing imperial authority. Administrative consolidation extended beyond legal reform. Basil reorganized provincial governance, ensuring that thematic and civil authorities operated in a coordinated framework. Governors were required to report regularly to the capital, while military commanders in the themes retained operational autonomy to respond to frontier threats. Fiscal oversight was reinforced through systematic auditing taxation records and standardized coinage, creating a transparent and accountable bureaucratic structure. Inscriptions and administrative seals from the period corroborate the centralization of provincial reporting mechanisms, illustrating the practical implementation of these reforms. Court culture under Basil I also reflected the dynasty's emphasis on centralized authority and symbolic legitimacy. Ceremonial protocols, titles, and court offices were formalized to reinforce hierarchical structures and underscore the emperor's supreme position. Historical sources note that such ceremonial practices were closely linked to administrative efficacy, as they codified channels of influence succession as loyalty within the bureaucratic elite. This careful structuring of power reduced factionalism and enhanced the predictability of imperial governance, allowing the Macedonian state to consolidate its authority both in Constantinople and across the provinces. Military readiness remained intertwined with administrative reform. Basil maintained the thematic armies, ensuring that provincial garrisons were well supplied and strategically positioned. The integration of military and fiscal administration, a principle inherited from earlier reforms under the Isaurians and reinforced by thematic stability, allowed the empire to sustain defense across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Aegean Islands. Coinage, supply records, and fortification projects from this period demonstrate the practical application of administrative oversight in maintaining military effectiveness, linking institutional reform directly to strategic resilience. Basil's legal and bureaucratic reforms also facilitated economic stability and urban development. Standardized taxation allowed the state to fund public works, maintain urban infrastructure, and support trade networks. Cities benefited from coordinated governance, improved policing, and predictable legal frameworks, which encouraged commercial activity and civic participation. Archaeological surveys of Constantinople, Thessalonica, and regional urban centers reveal investments in public buildings, fortifications, and civic amenities, reflecting a period of deliberate institutional strengthening that supported broader economic and military objectives. The basilica and administrative measures also influenced ecclesiastical governance. By providing a consistent legal framework, the emperor could regulate property disputes, clerical obligations, and church-state relations. Monastic institutions and diocesan authorities were integrated into this structure, aligning religious and civil administration in a cooperative system. Legal decrees from Basil's reign emphasized the emperor's role as both guardian of orthodoxy and arbiter of civil order, illustrating the symbiotic relationship between centralized governance and ecclesiastical authority. By the end of Basil I's reign, the Byzantine Empire had achieved renewed administrative coherence, legal clarity, and institutional stability. The consolidation of law, bureaucratic structure, and court hierarchy created a foundation upon which the Macedonian dynasty could pursue cultural, military, and economic advancement. These reforms ensured continuity and resilience across the empire's provinces, positioning the state to capitalize on subsequent periods of prosperity and territorial expansion. These reforms enabled a sustained period of prosperity. The 10th century witnessed a remarkable revival of scholarship. Under the Macedonian dynasty, particularly during the reigns of Basil I's successors, the Byzantine Empire experienced a cultural and intellectual renaissance that reinforced the ideological and administrative strength of the state. Literacy and education became increasingly institutionalized, with imperial patronage extending to both secular and ecclesiastical learning. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and court-sponsored scribal workshops facilitated the production and preservation of manuscripts, ensuring that legal, theological, and classical texts were copied and transmitted. Paleographical evidence demonstrates significant standardization in script, ornamentation, and codex production, reflecting both practical administrative needs and aesthetic refinement. The revival of classical learning was central to this intellectual flourishing. Byzantine scholars studied works of Homer, Aristotle, Plato, and medical and mathematical texts from late antiquity, integrating them with Christian philosophical traditions. This synthesis provided a coherent framework for both secular administration and ecclesiastical discourse. Figures such as Photios, Patriarch of Constantinople, exemplify the scholarly leadership of the period, producing encyclopedic works, philological commentaries, and theological treatises that influenced both internal governance and external diplomacy. Written correspondence and surviving manuscripts attest to the systematic approach to scholarship, demonstrating the interconnection between literacy, intellectual culture, and statecraft. Byzantine art and architecture also flourished during this period, reflecting both imperial ideology and religious devotion. Church construction, including the renovation of Constantinople's major basilicas and the development of regional monasteries, employed sophisticated architectural techniques, mosaics, and iconography. Frescoes, icons, and illuminated manuscripts demonstrate a high degree of technical skill and thematic consistency, often conveying theological and political messages aligned with imperial authority. Archaeological evidence, including building inscriptions and workshop remains, confirms that imperial and ecclesiastical patronage sustained an extensive network of artisans and laborers, fostering both cultural production and local economic activity. The codification and transmission of knowledge further enhanced administrative and military efficiency. Legal texts, manuals on siegecraft, agricultural treatises, and medical compendia were systematically copied and disseminated across provincial centers. These texts ensured that thematic commanders, provincial officials, and clerical authorities could access standardized knowledge, reducing errors in governance and reinforcing cohesion across the empire. Surviving Byzantine codices demonstrate careful attention to organization, annotations, and cross-referencing, indicating a deliberate strategy to support both learning and practical administration. Literacy and learning were closely linked to bureaucratic competence. Skilled scribes and educated elites staffed chancelleries, ensuring that imperial decrees, tax records, and military orders were accurately drafted and transmitted. This professionalization of the administrative workforce contributed directly to the empire's resilience, allowing Constantinople to maintain control over distant provinces and coordinate defensive, economic, and diplomatic initiatives. Epigraphic and papyrological evidence from the period confirms the expansion of such administrative literacy beyond the capital, reflecting a diffusion of knowledge throughout the thematic system. The Macedonian Renaissance also reinforced ideological cohesion. Classical motifs, biblical narratives, and theological commentary in art and literature promoted a unified vision of the empire, linking past traditions with contemporary governance. This cultural cohesion strengthened loyalty among elites, educated clergy, and provincial administrators, providing an intangible layer of stability that complemented military and fiscal measures. Imperial patronage ensured that cultural production served both intellectual and political objectives, integrating scholarship, ritual, and civic identity into a coherent framework. By the late 10th century, Byzantine cultural strength paralleled its military resurgence, creating an empire capable of defending its borders, asserting influence diplomatically, and sustaining a sophisticated and literate society. The flourishing of scholarship, art, and architecture reinforced administrative and ideological cohesion, supporting both the practical needs of governance and the broader projection of imperial authority. Cultural strength paralleled the empire's military resurgence. Under Basil II, the empire reached its greatest medieval strength. The reign of Basil II, 976 to 1025 CE, represents the pinnacle of Byzantine military and territorial achievement during the Macedonian dynasty. Ascending the throne as a young co-emperor, Basil faced immediate challenges from internal aristocratic factions and external adversaries, notably the Bulgarians and regional powers in the eastern provinces. Early in his reign, he relied on experienced generals such as Nikephoros and later strategists within the thematic armies to stabilize the empire, integrating disciplined military doctrine with long-term strategic objectives. A defining feature of Basil II's rule was the campaign against the First Bulgarian Empire. Beginning in the 990s, a series of systematic offensives aimed to subdue Bulgarian resistance and secure the Balkans for Constantinople. Byzantine chroniclers, including John Skylitz's, detail the rigor of these campaigns, careful siegecraft, logistical planning across difficult terrain, and the coordination of thematic and elite tagmatic forces. The decisive Battle of Kleidion in 1014, where tens of thousands of Bulgarian troops were captured or neutralized, exemplifies the effectiveness of Basil's approach. Reports of the emperor blinding prisoners, though controversial, illustrate the combination of psychological warfare and strategic calculation that reinforced Byzantine dominance in the region. Simultaneously, the empire extended its influence in the eastern frontier, particularly in Armenia and parts of the Caucasus. Basil II capitalized on local political instability, forging alliances with sympathetic Armenian nobility while launching targeted military interventions to secure key fortresses and trade routes. Control over these territories provided strategic depth, enhanced revenue collection, and reinforced the empire's capacity to project power into neighboring regions, demonstrating a coherent integration of diplomacy, military strategy, and administrative oversight. The Macedonian army under Basil II combined thematic and professional forces, creating a balanced structure capable of sustained campaigns. Soldier farmers maintained readiness for regional defense, while elite tagmata provided mobile strike capability. Supply networks, garrison rotations, and communication systems were systematically managed to support multi-year campaigns, ensuring that logistics did not limit operational effectiveness. Archaeological evidence, including fortified sites in Thrace and the Danubian corridor, corroborates the extent of military preparation and infrastructure that underpinned Basil's successes. Fiscal and administrative reforms complemented military expansion. Basil II maintained careful oversight of taxation and land grants, ensuring that provincial revenues supported the army without undermining the peasantry. Legal mechanisms, rooted in the Basilica and subsequent codifications, facilitated the enforcement of property rights and the redistribution of lands confiscated from rebellious nobles. This combination of fiscal prudence and legal authority enabled sustained military campaigns while maintaining social stability within the empire. Basil II's campaigns had enduring geopolitical consequences. The annexation of Bulgaria and the consolidation of eastern territories solidified Byzantine control over key trade routes, fortified natural frontiers, and reduced the likelihood of coordinated threats from neighboring states. The empire's borders during his reign represented the maximum extent of Byzantine influence in the medieval period, illustrating the interplay of military capability, administrative efficiency, and strategic foresight. The emperor also leveraged ideological and ceremonial tools to reinforce authority. Public celebrations of victories, the construction of monuments, and ecclesiastical endorsements served to legitimize military achievements, integrating warfare, culture, and religious symbolism into the broader projection of imperial power. These measures strengthened loyalty among troops, provincial elites, and the court, ensuring cohesion across a geographically and ethnically diverse empire. By 1025 CE, the Byzantine Empire had achieved unprecedented territorial and military consolidation. Basil II's campaigns against the Bulgarians' expansion into Armenia, and the disciplined organization of thematic and professional forces marked a high point of medieval imperial authority. The integration of military, fiscal, and administrative systems under a centralized yet flexible command structure exemplified the mature operational capacity of the Macedonian state. After Basil II's death, internal dynamics began to shift. As territory expanded, internal cohesion weakened. Following the death of Basil II in 1025 CE, the Byzantine Empire entered a period of relative stability in territorial terms but growing internal structural pressures. One of the most significant developments was the accumulation of large estates by the military aristocracy, often referred to as the dynatoi. Wealthy landowners acquired extensive holdings through inheritance, imperial grants, and the consolidation of smaller peasant plots, gradually undermining the traditional thematic system. As soldiers became increasingly dependent on aristocratic landlords rather than directly serving the state, the mobility and readiness of provincial forces declined, weakening the once reliable backbone of Byzantine defense. Fiscal strain accompanied these changes. Imperial revenues were increasingly directed toward sustaining court extravagance, urban development, and diplomatic obligations, rather than directly supporting thematic garrisons. Tax exemptions granted to monasteries and the aristocracy further diminished the fiscal base, leaving the central government less able to recruit, equip, and deploy troops across distant frontiers. Contemporary chronicles and fiscal records highlight the growing gap between central authority and provincial military readiness, indicating a structural vulnerability that had long-term implications for the empire's strategic posture. The rise of the military aristocracy also reshaped the political landscape. Aristocratic families leveraged their wealth and control over local armed forces to influence succession, court appointments, and policy decisions. Provincial governors increasingly acted with considerable autonomy, sometimes prioritizing their estates over imperial directives. Legal documents and inscriptions from the 11th century demonstrate that imperial attempts to curb aristocratic power were met with resistance, revealing a persistent tension between central authority and regional elites. This imbalance weakened administrative coherence and undermined the integrated fiscal military system that had supported Byzantine power under the Macedonian dynasty. Social consequences accompanied these economic shifts. Peasant populations increasingly fell under the control of powerful landlords, reducing the pool of free, locally obligated soldiers within the themes. The integration of landholding and military service that had sustained the thematic armies for centuries was gradually eroded, producing a decline in provincial military capacity. Archaeological surveys of Anatolian villages and fortifications indicate less direct state investment in local defense infrastructure during this period, consistent with the weakening of the thematic model. Externally, the empire continued to face threats on multiple fronts. The Seljuk Turks were beginning to emerge in eastern Anatolia, while Norman and Pecheneg incursions challenged the Balkans. The combination of reduced thematic forces, delayed recruitment, and stretched fiscal resources meant that the empire's frontier defenses were increasingly vulnerable. Military historians emphasize that the empire's over-reliance on mercenary forces, rather than locally rooted thematic soldiers, limited operational flexibility and amplified strategic risk. Culturally and administratively, the central government sought to maintain legitimacy through court ceremonial legal pronouncements and ecclesiastical patronage. While these measures reinforced imperial prestige in Constantinople, they were insufficient to address the underlying structural weaknesses in military organization and provincial control. The divergence between ceremonial authority and functional capacity became increasingly apparent, highlighting the growing disjunction between the empire's image and its operational reality. By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire had reached a point of overextension and internal fragility. Land consolidation by the aristocracy, fiscal pressures, and the decline of thematic armies collectively weakened the mechanisms that had sustained military and administrative coherence for centuries. While territorial boundaries remained largely intact, the internal cohesion necessary to defend and govern them effectively was eroding. These pressures would soon directly affect military performance. By the mid-11th century, the eastern defenses were dangerously thin. During the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire confronted mounting pressure along its eastern frontier as the Seljuk Turks expanded into Anatolia. Unlike earlier Arab incursions, which the thematic armies had countered through coordinated regional defense, the Seljuks combined mobility, mounted archery, and opportunistic raiding to exploit weaknesses in the provincial military structure. With thematic forces diminished by aristocratic land accumulation and fiscal neglect, local garrisons were under strength and often poorly equipped. Contemporary accounts, including the Chronicle of Michael Italiates, describe towns and fortresses that were theoretically defended but incapable of sustaining prolonged assaults, demonstrating a critical erosion of frontier security. The weakening of the thematic armies was compounded by reliance on mercenary contingents. By the 1050s, the state increasingly contracted Norman Pecheneg and other foreign troops to supplement diminished provincial forces. While effective in short-term operations, these mercenaries were costly, less invested in local territorial defense, and prone to political opportunism. Fiscal records indicate that the central treasury was increasingly strained by the need to fund mercenary wages, reducing flexibility for infrastructure repair, supply chains, and the maintenance of strategic fortresses. Archaeological surveys of Anatolian frontier fortifications reveal signs of neglect and partial abandonment, consistent with chronicled gaps in garrison strength. Seljuk incursions targeted vulnerable regions such as Armenia, Cappadocia, and eastern Anatolia, seizing fortified positions and disrupting trade routes. The cumulative effect of these raids was both economic and strategic. Local agricultural production declined, urban centers lost tax revenue, and lines of communication between provincial governors and Constantinople were frequently severed. Historians note that these pressures accelerated the contraction of imperial authority in the east, forcing the empire to adopt a more defensive posture focused on the remaining fortified cities rather than projecting power across the frontier. Internal administrative challenges amplified military difficulties. Provincial governors, often drawn from the landed aristocracy, had varying commitment to defending state interests versus protecting their own estates. The erosion of central oversight and the persistence of local factionalism created inconsistencies in defense planning, delaying coordinated responses to incursions and reducing the effectiveness of the empire's remaining thematic troops. Imperial correspondence and surviving fiscal records document repeated requests for reinforcements and supplies that were only partially fulfilled, illustrating the structural strain on the state's eastern defense system. The loss of these frontier territories had strategic consequences. Anatolia, long the empire's economic and demographic heartland, was increasingly exposed, reducing the depth and resilience of Byzantine military logistics. The contraction of defensible space limited the empire's ability to field concentrated armies and forced reliance on fortified urban centers as defensive hubs. Archaeological excavations in key Anatolian towns, such as Caesarea and Melitene, reveal hastily reinforced walls and damaged infrastructure consistent with repeated Seljuk pressure, highlighting the practical realities of frontier erosion. Politically, the inability to secure the eastern provinces weakened imperial authority both at court and in the provinces. Chroniclers note that local populations increasingly negotiated with Seljuk forces, paying tribute or accepting occupation to avoid destruction. These developments undermined central legitimacy and reinforced the perception that the empire was overextended, providing both internal and external actors with opportunities to challenge imperial control. By 1070, the eastern frontier had been critically compromised, with diminished thematic forces, eroded fortifications, and a reliance on mercenary contingents unable to replicate the mobility and local knowledge of the traditional armies. The empire's capacity to project power into Anatolia was severely limited, setting the stage for a major confrontation with the Seljuks. This process culminated in a pivotal confrontation. In 1071, a single battle accelerated a geopolitical transformation. The Battle of Manzikert in August 1071 stands as a critical turning point in Byzantine history, demonstrating the culmination of structural weaknesses in the empire's military and administrative systems. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a field army composed of thematic forces, mercenary contingents, and allied contingents against the advancing Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan. Chroniclers such as Michael Italiates and later Anna Comnene provide detailed accounts of the campaign, emphasizing the challenges posed by a fragmented army, uneven loyalty among provincial commanders, and logistical difficulties in the rugged terrain of eastern Anatolia. The confrontation at Manzikert exposed the vulnerabilities of the Byzantine military. Internal divisions among commanders, partly a result of aristocratic rivalries and factionalism, undermined cohesion. Mercenary contingents, while numerically significant, were less disciplined and at times uncooperative, reflecting the declining integration of professional soldiers with the provincial thematic system. The Seljuks, exploiting superior mobility and tactical coordination, executed enveloping maneuvers that decisively disrupted the Byzantine formations. Contemporary sources report the capture of Romanos IV during the battle, a symbolic and operational catastrophe that precipitated immediate political and military disarray. The aftermath of Manzikert had profound geopolitical consequences. Central Anatolia, previously the heartland of the thematic system, rapidly fell under Seljuk influence. Many local garrisons surrendered or abandoned their posts, and fortified towns were seized or isolated. Fiscal and administrative records indicate a sharp decline in imperial revenue from these regions, compounding the empire's ability to project authority and sustain military operations. The loss of these territories marked the effective collapse of Byzantine control over Anatolia, reversing centuries of strategic depth that had supported the empire's defense and economic stability. Political fragmentation followed the battlefield disaster. Romanos IV's capture and subsequent deposition by internal rivals exposed the fragility of imperial succession and elite cohesion. Competing claimants vied for the throne, while aristocratic families leveraged their private armies to secure regional influence. The resulting civil strife further delayed military recovery and contributed to a prolonged period of vulnerability in the empire's eastern provinces. Contemporary chronicles emphasize that this combination of external defeat and internal disunity amplified the empire's strategic weaknesses, making the restoration of control in Anatolia increasingly difficult. The thematic army system, already weakened by the rise of landed aristocracy and the contraction of fiscal support, proved unable to recover fully in the immediate aftermath. Provincial soldiers were either absorbed into local power networks, abandoned service, or were lost in battle. Subsequent military campaigns relied heavily on mercenaries and hastily assembled forces, which lacked the institutional cohesion and local knowledge that had characterized Byzantine defense in previous centuries. Archaeological evidence, including abandoned fortifications and disrupted settlement patterns in Cappadocia and Phrygia, corroborates the widespread territorial destabilization caused by the battle. Manzikert also had long-term strategic and demographic effects. The settlement of Turkish populations into Anatolia accelerated cultural and political transformation, while the loss of agricultural heartlands reduced the empire's economic base. Trade routes connecting the eastern provinces to Constantinople were disrupted, undermining fiscal revenues and limiting the empire's capacity to field large, sustained armies. These changes initiated a slow but irreversible process in which Anatolia, previously the empire's demographic and military backbone, became increasingly contested and fragmented. Despite localized Byzantine resistance in coastal regions and urban centers, the empire faced a sustained period of military contraction and political recalibration. The central government, weakened by civil strife and diminished revenues, was compelled to seek new leadership capable of restoring authority, reorganizing military forces, and defending the remaining territories. The loss of Anatolia set the stage for subsequent emperors to implement reforms and defensive strategies. Though the empire's trajectory had fundamentally shifted, with Anatolia destabilized, the empire sought new leadership. Alexios I confronted crisis with calculated political strategy. The reign of Alexios I Komnenos, 1081 to 1118 CE, marked a decisive period of recovery following the political and military fragmentation that followed Manzikert. Upon ascending the throne, Alexios faced a combination of internal disorder, aristocratic factionalism, and external threats from the Normans' Pecheneg. and Seljuk Turks. Immediate stabilization required both administrative reform and military restructuring. Alexios reorganized the imperial army by integrating thematic forces with pronoia grants, land-based assignments providing soldiers with income in exchange for military service, thus reviving local recruitment while restoring loyalty to the central government. Externally, Alexios confronted the Norman invasions of the Western Balkans and the Adriatic, including the siege of Dyrrhachium in 1081. Strategic diplomacy, combined with tactical defensive measures, enabled the Byzantines to resist prolonged attacks despite limited resources. Contemporary chronicles, such as those of Anna Komnene in the Alexiad, detail the careful negotiation of alliances, the strategic use of fortifications, and the mobilization of both native and mercenary troops. These measures not only stabilized immediate threats but also demonstrated the effectiveness of combining military and political acumen under a revitalized Komnenian administration. A defining feature of Alexios' reign was the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, which he navigated with both caution and pragmatism. The arrival of Western armies presented both opportunity and risk. Crusader forces could aid in recovering lost Anatolian territories, but unchecked, they threatened Byzantine sovereignty. Alexios engaged in calculated diplomacy, negotiating oaths of fealty from key Crusader leaders, providing logistical support, and carefully directing their campaigns to align with Byzantine strategic interests. Anna Komnene's accounts emphasize Alexios' skill in balancing cooperation with control, ensuring that Crusader movements reinforced rather than undermined imperial objectives. Alexios also implemented administrative reforms to consolidate control over provinces and reduce the power of fractious aristocrats. By appointing loyal officials, enforcing fiscal accountability, and reorganizing thematic commands, he strengthened central authority while maintaining flexibility to respond to frontier crises. Coinage, taxation records, and correspondence confirmed the systematic revival of imperial oversight, which allowed Constantinople to fund defensive and diplomatic operations without overextending fiscal capacity. Religious policy remained a key tool in reinforcing legitimacy. Alexios cultivated alliances with the Orthodox Church, granting privileges and ceremonial recognition to support his rule. Monastic patronage and ecclesiastical appointments were coordinated to reinforce loyalty among provincial elites and clergy, integrating spiritual authority with imperial governance. This combination of military, administrative, and religious strategy enabled the empire to withstand external pressures while restoring internal cohesion. By the end of Alexios I's reign, the Byzantine Empire had achieved stabilization and partial territorial recovery, laying the foundation for the Komnenian military revival. Anatolia remained contested, but the integration of thematic forces, pronoia-based recruitment, but careful diplomacy with Western powers allowed the empire to maintain defensive depth and secure critical borders. The mechanisms developed under Alexios' military, administrative, and diplomatic would be expanded and refined by his successors, providing a durable framework for imperial resurgence. His reforms provided a foundation for further consolidation. John II governed with methodical discipline. The reign of John II Komnenos, 1118 to 1143 CE, is widely regarded as a period of steady consolidation and measured expansion. Building upon the foundation laid by his father, Alexios I, John focused on restoring fiscal stability, reinforcing administrative structures, and methodically recovering lost territories in Anatolia and the Balkans. Contemporary chronicles, including Anna Komnene's Alexiad and later accounts by Nicetas Choniates, emphasize John's deliberate approach, prioritizing long-term institutional resilience over rapid, unsustainable gains. Fiscal repair was central to John II's strategy. He implemented systematic taxation policies to balance imperial revenue with the need to fund military operations, urban infrastructure, and court expenditures. By auditing provincial accounts and curbing abuses by local aristocrats, John restored a measure of financial control that had eroded under the pressures of previous decades. Surviving imperial decrees and coinage evidence indicate efforts to standardize currency and improve revenue collection, ensuring that provincial contributions were reliably directed toward both defense and administration. Militarily, John II pursued gradual campaigns to secure Anatolia and reclaim strategic frontier regions. These operations combined diplomacy with force. John negotiated alliances with local Armenian and Georgian rulers, while employing thematic armies supplemented by paranoia-based recruits and mercenary contingents. He systematically reduced the influence of rebellious nobles and fortified key towns, creating a network of defensible positions that could support both local populations and mobile imperial forces. Archaeological remains, including fortifications at Iconium and Cappadocia, reflect coordinated reconstruction and reinforcement efforts during his reign. John II's approach to governance emphasized administrative professionalism. Provincial governors and military commanders were selected for competence and loyalty, reducing the factionalism that had weakened Byzantine responses in earlier periods. Reports of coordinated campaigns and judicial oversight demonstrate that central authority was exercised through both legal and military channels, ensuring that policy decisions were implemented effectively across the empire. This administrative rigor reinforced stability in both core and frontier provinces, allowing sustained recovery without overextension. Religious policy complemented John's administrative efforts. By maintaining close relations with the Orthodox Church, supporting monastic institutions, and overseeing ecclesiastical appointments, John reinforced ideological cohesion and social stability. Church endorsement of imperial authority helped integrate regional elites into the governance framework and provided moral legitimacy for both taxation and military obligations. Surviving correspondence between the emperor and patriarchs demonstrates the deliberate coordination between civil and ecclesiastical leadership. John II also pursued incremental territorial recovery. While not engaging in large-scale conquests comparable to Basil II, his campaigns restored Byzantine influence over critical regions of western Anatolia and the northern Balkans. Emphasis on fortification, garrisoning, and securing trade routes allowed these territories to remain under imperial control, supporting both economic recovery and strategic depth. Contemporary accounts highlight the importance of steady, disciplined campaigns rather than sudden or risky offensives, illustrating a continuity of institutionalized military planning. By the end of John II's reign, the empire had achieved a balance between administrative efficiency, fiscal responsibility, and military readiness. Anatolia, previously fragmented and vulnerable, was increasingly integrated into the imperial system, providing a reliable base for further expansion. John's disciplined approach fostered long-term stability, strengthened the central government, and ensured that imperial authority remained credible both domestically and abroad. These efforts culminated in the expansive policies of Manuel I. Manuel I aimed to reassert imperial authority across the eastern Mediterranean. The reign of Manuel I Comnenos, 1143 to 1180 CE, was characterized by ambitious diplomacy, military engagement, and a determined effort to project Byzantine influence throughout the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Italian peninsula. Building on the administrative and military foundations laid by Alexios I and John II, Manuel pursued a policy that combined strategic alliances, ceremonial prestige, and selective military intervention to expand imperial authority without overextending the state's resources. Contemporary sources, including Nicetas Choniates and Western chroniclers, emphasize both the sophistication and the limits of his approach. In the Western Mediterranean, Manuel cultivated alliances with the papacy, Norman principalities, and Venice, seeking to secure trade routes, maritime support, and diplomatic leverage. He engaged in arranged marriages and oath-bound treaties, intertwining dynastic policy with political objectives. These measures temporarily stabilized relations with Italian states and fostered limited Byzantine influence in southern Italy, demonstrating a calculated integration of soft power and military presence. However, these initiatives required substantial financial and logistical resources, exposing vulnerabilities in the empire's treasury and administrative apparatus. In the Balkans and Hungary, Manuel confronted both opportunistic incursions and persistent regional instability. Campaigns against the Hungarians, Serbs, and Pecheneg relied on a combination of rapid troop movements, fortified border cities, and negotiated settlements. The emperor sought to reassert nominal suzerainty over vassal states while maintaining a flexible defensive posture. Military records and contemporary chronicles indicate that these operations were largely successful in maintaining Byzantine influence. But they also consumed considerable manpower and diverted attention from other pressing fronts. Manuel's eastern policy focused on Anatolia, where the Seljuk Turks continued to present a strategic challenge. Early in his reign, Byzantine forces regained temporary control of key frontier regions, demonstrating the ongoing effectiveness of thematic and pronoia-based armies. However, the Battle of Myriokephalon in 1176 revealed the limitations of sustained offensive operations against mobile Turkish forces and difficult terrain. The defeat, while not catastrophic in territorial terms, underscored the structural constraints of the Byzantine military system: logistical challenges, over-reliance on heavy infantry, while the difficulty of coordinating diverse provincial and mercenary forces in mountainous regions. This outcome marked a turning point, demonstrating that diplomatic maneuvering and strategic calculation could only partially compensate for evolving military realities. Administratively, Manuel continued the Comnenian emphasis on centralized oversight and the integration of aristocratic elites into imperial governance. Provincial governors were tasked with both fiscal management and military readiness, while pronoia grants ensured the loyalty of regional magnates. Nonetheless, the demands of simultaneous campaigns, alliance maintenance, and frontier defense imposed significant strain on the bureaucracy. Surviving fiscal records and imperial correspondence reveal increasing expenditure pressures and the necessity of prioritizing certain theaters over others, illustrating the practical limits of expansive imperial policy. Religiously and ideologically, Manuel leveraged ceremonial authority and ecclesiastical endorsement to reinforce legitimacy. Public displays, church patronage, and the use of symbolic titles in diplomacy strengthened his personal prestige and projected the image of an empire at the center of Mediterranean and Eastern politics. These measures enhanced short-term cohesion but could not fully address underlying vulnerabilities in provincial defense and fiscal sustainability. By the end of Manuel I's reign, the Byzantine Empire had achieved a remarkable projection of influence across multiple regions. But structural and logistical limitations constrained long-term consolidation. Territorial holdings were largely maintained, and diplomatic networks were robust, yet the defeat at Myriokephalon, combined with ongoing fiscal and military pressures, signaled that the empire's capacity for sustained expansion had reached its limits. Internal cohesion, dependent on a balance between central authority and aristocratic cooperation, would be increasingly tested in subsequent decades. His death marked the end of sustained stability. By the late 12th century, imperial institutions were dangerously eroded. The reign of the Angeloi dynasty, 1185 to 1204 CE, marked a decisive period of internal decline that undermined the Byzantine Empire's administrative, military, and fiscal structures. Following the death of Manuel I Komnenos, his successors lacked both the authority and strategic acumen to maintain the cohesion achieved under the Komnenian Restoration. Imperial offices became increasingly subject to corruption and factional manipulation, with positions often sold or granted based on favoritism rather than competence. Contemporary chroniclers, including Nicetas Choniates, describe widespread mismanagement and a bureaucratic apparatus increasingly incapable of coordinating effective governance or defense. Fiscal insolvency compounded administrative weakness. Successive emperors, notably Alexios III Angelos, relied on heavy taxation, confiscation of private property, and the sale of offices to fund court expenditures and hire mercenaries. These policies alienated both the provincial aristocracy and urban populations, leading to declining loyalty and the erosion of traditional revenue streams. Coinage debasement and irregular pay for soldiers further weakened military readiness, leaving frontier garrisons underfunded and morale low. Surviving fiscal records and numismatic evidence illustrate the rapid deterioration of the treasury and the empire's reduced capacity to respond to external threats. Military structures that had sustained Byzantine power for centuries were increasingly ineffective. The thematic system, already weakened in earlier centuries, had largely disappeared, and reliance on mercenary contingents created forces that were costly, inconsistent in loyalty, and incapable of rapid deployment. Fortifications, especially in the Balkans and Anatolia, suffered from neglect, with many previously fortified towns inadequately maintained. Archaeological surveys and contemporary accounts indicate that defensive cohesion had largely collapsed, leaving strategic corridors and economic centers vulnerable to both internal rebellion and foreign intervention. Social and political fragmentation further destabilized the empire. Aristocratic factions competed for influence at court, often acting in their own interests rather than those of the central government. Provincial uprisings and secessionist movements became more common, illustrating the breakdown of imperial authority beyond Constantinople. Chroniclers report that the capital itself experienced riots, popular unrest, and coups, reflecting both popular dissatisfaction and elite factionalism. These internal divisions severely limited the empire's ability to organize coherent defense or implement effective administrative reforms. The cultural and ideological legitimacy of the Angeloi also suffered. The emperor's incapacity to enforce religious or legal norms weakened the authority of both the Orthodox Church and civil administration. Disputes over ecclesiastical appointments, combined with clerical criticism of imperial corruption, eroded the perception of the emperor as a divinely sanctioned ruler. Monastic and urban sources document growing discontent, highlighting the interplay between moral authority and political power in Byzantine governance. By 1203, the cumulative effects of administrative corruption, fiscal insolvency, and military inefficiency left the Byzantine Empire profoundly vulnerable to external intervention. The state's weakened capacity to project power, defend key cities, or maintain political cohesion created conditions that invited opportunistic actors, particularly from the West, to exploit Byzantine weaknesses. Internal disunity, combined with the failure of the Angeloi to implement meaningful reform, directly set the stage for the events that would culminate in the Fourth Crusade. This instability opened the path to external intervention. In 1204, Constantinople fell to fellow Christians. The Fourth Crusade represented a catastrophic intersection of Western ambition and Byzantine fragility. Initially called to reclaim Jerusalem, the Crusader army became entangled in Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine political intrigues. Venice, seeking maritime dominance and economic advantage, directed the crusade toward Constantinople, exploiting the empire's weakened leadership under Alexios for Angelos. Contemporary accounts, including those of Geoffrey of Villehardouin and Nicetas Choniates, emphasized the role of financial indebtedness and factional alliances in redirecting the Crusader forces, illustrating how political and economic leverage shaped military outcomes. By 1203, the Crusaders had reached Constantinople, ostensibly to reinstate Alexios IV, son of the deposed Isaac II Angelos. Initial negotiations revealed deep divisions within the city's population and ruling elite. The imperial treasury was inadequate to satisfy the Crusaders' demands, and local aristocratic factions were either unwilling or unable to mount effective resistance. Chroniclers describe heightened tension between the Latin invaders and the Byzantine populace, including riots and barricaded neighborhoods, reflecting both social and political unrest. The siege of 1204 culminated in the sack of Constantinople. Crusader forces, combining Western Knights and Venetian naval support, breached the city's formidable walls through a combination of engineering, strategic coordination, and exploitation of weak defenses. Primary sources detail extensive looting of palaces, churches, and monasteries, including the Hagia Sophia, and the dispersal of immense wealth to Western Europe. Beyond material loss, the sack represented a symbolic rupture. Byzantine political authority was dismantled, and centuries of continuity were broken. The fall of Constantinople precipitated the fragmentation of Byzantine territories. Successor states emerged, including the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond, each claiming legitimacy and seeking to restore Byzantine governance. These polities maintained elements of imperial administration, legal codes, and Orthodox religious authority, preserving Byzantine identity in exile despite the loss of the capital. Contemporary correspondence and charters indicate efforts to coordinate military, diplomatic, and ecclesiastical networks across these fragmented territories, demonstrating resilience even amid territorial collapse. Venetian influence and the establishment of the Latin Empire in Constantinople introduced a new political order. Latin rulers implemented Western feudal structures, while controlling key trade routes and exploiting Byzantine administrative expertise for their own governance. Chroniclers report widespread displacement of the native Byzantine elite, creating long-term social and economic disruption. The Latin occupation highlighted the vulnerabilities of the Byzantine state to external opportunism, emphasizing the consequences of internal division and weakened institutional capacity. The Fourth Crusade also had lasting cultural and religious repercussions. Orthodox ecclesiastical authority was subordinated or displaced, while Latin liturgical practices were introduced in the capital. The appropriation of sacred relics and manuscripts transported to Western Europe had enduring effects on Byzantine intellectual and artistic heritage. While Byzantine cultural traditions survived in the successor states, the rupture marked a profound disruption in the continuity of the Eastern Roman institutional and spiritual framework. By 1204, the Byzantine Empire had suffered both structural and symbolic collapse, losing its capital, treasury, and core territories. Yet, the persistence of successor states demonstrated the durability of Byzantine political and cultural identity, even in exile. These polities would provide the foundation for eventual restoration, maintaining legal, administrative, and ecclesiastical continuity that allowed the Byzantine tradition to endure. After the conquest, Byzantine political identity survived in exile. Despite losing its capital, Byzantine statecraft endured. Following the catastrophic sack of Constantinople in 1204, the Byzantine Empire entered a period of political fragmentation, with multiple successor states claiming legitimacy and striving to preserve the institutions of the Eastern Roman world. The most prominent of these were the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Epirus, and the Empire of Trebizond. Each emerged in former Byzantine territories, asserting authority through continuity of administration, orthodox religious structures, and dynastic legitimacy. These states became focal points for resistance, recovery, and the preservation of Byzantine identity in exile. The Empire of Nicaea, established by Theodore I Lascaris, became the principal center for Byzantine restoration efforts. Located in Western Asia Minor, Nicaea benefited from proximity to Constantinople, a dense urban network, and productive agricultural hinterlands. Theodore and his successors prioritized administrative consolidation, maintaining legal frameworks, tax systems, and provincial governance that reflected Constantinopolitan practices. Surviving charters, seals, and fiscal records revealed deliberate attempts to replicate central authority in exile, demonstrating a remarkable continuity of bureaucratic and military structures despite territorial contraction. Military organization in Nicaea was oriented toward defense and gradual reconquest. The empire relied on pronoia-based recruitment, thematic remnants, and mercenary contingents to secure borders against Latin forces, Seljuk incursions, and rival Byzantine claimants in Epirus and Trebizond. Fortifications were reinforced in key towns such as Nicaea, Nicomedia, and Lampsacus, and mobile forces patrolled strategic corridors connecting Anatolia to the Sea of Marmara. Archaeological evidence supports the adaptation of defensive architecture to respond to new threats, reflecting a pragmatic approach to limited resources. The Despotate of Epirus, established in western Greece, maintained its own claim to Byzantine legitimacy and frequently contested authority with Nicaea. Epirus served as both a refuge for displaced elites and a staging ground for military campaigns in the Western Balkans. Despite its smaller size, the Despotate preserved orthodox ecclesiastical structures, upheld Roman law traditions, and sought alliances with Latin and regional powers, highlighting the interplay between survival and diplomatic pragmatism. The Empire of Trebizond, located along the southeastern Black Sea coast, maintained a separate dynastic lineage and focused on regional autonomy. Trebizond leveraged its geographic isolation to secure relative stability, control trade routes, and maintain local governance consistent with Byzantine traditions. Its survival illustrates the adaptability of imperial structures under conditions of geographic and political marginalization. Numismatic and documentary evidence indicates ongoing engagement with Orthodox religious authority, trade networks, and legal administrative practices despite its peripheral location. Throughout this period, religion remained a central pillar of continuity. All successor states maintained close relations with the Orthodox Church, supporting monastic communities, appointing bishops, and preserving liturgical and doctrinal traditions. Ecclesiastical cohesion reinforced political legitimacy and provided a unifying identity across fragmented territories. Correspondence between patriarchs in exile and provincial hierarchies underscores the deliberate maintenance of spiritual authority as a stabilizing force during political upheaval. By mid-century, the Empire of Nicaea emerged as the dominant successor state, leveraging both internal consolidation and opportunistic diplomacy. Nicaean emperors, including John III Doukas Vatatzes, pursued a combination of territorial expansion and strategic alliances, gradually reconquering western Anatolian towns and establishing a credible claim to Constantinople. Military campaigns were complemented by legal codification, fiscal reform, and administrative centralization, ensuring that regained territories could be effectively governed. Chronicles and surviving imperial decrees document these deliberate, incremental steps toward restoration. Despite territorial limitations and ongoing competition, Byzantine statecraft in exile preserved key institutional and cultural foundations. Law, administration, military organization, and religious authority remained remarkably resilient, allowing the empire to endure as a coherent political and cultural entity. Material evidence, including fortified settlements, monastic centers, and administrative documents, demonstrates continuity of governance and identity across fragmented domains. These efforts culminated in the eventual recapture of Constantinople. In 1261, the empire regained its capital but not its former strength. The recapture of Constantinople by Michael VIII Palaiologos marked the formal restoration of the Byzantine Empire after nearly 6 decades in exile. Following the fall of Constantinople to the Latins in 1204, the Empire of Nicaea had steadily consolidated its territories in western Anatolia, creating the conditions for Michael VIII to launch a decisive campaign to reclaim the historic capital in 1261. While the return to Constantinople represented a symbolic triumph and the reassertion of Byzantine continuity, the empire's structural foundations remained fragile. Fiscal deficits, reduced population levels, and fragmented provincial authority limited the capacity for comprehensive reconstruction. Michael VIII undertook an extensive program of administrative and urban restoration. Efforts included repairing the city's fortifications, revitalizing the imperial palace, and re-establishing key bureaucratic offices. Contemporary sources, including the chronicles of George Pachymeres, indicate that much of Constantinople required rebuilding after decades of neglect, and substantial resources were allocated to re-establish basic civic infrastructure. However, these efforts were constrained by a depleted treasury, limited manpower, and the economic disruption caused by previous Latin occupation. Taxation had to be increased to fund reconstruction, further straining relationships with both urban elites and provincial landholders. Territorial control outside the capital was inconsistent. While western Anatolia and parts of Thrace were under firm Byzantine authority, large portions of Greece, the Peloponnese, and the Aegean Islands were contested by Latin principalities, local magnates, and mercenary forces. The empire relied on a combination of military garrisons, alliances with local elites, and naval patrols to maintain control over these dispersed holdings. Archaeological surveys of fortifications in the Aegean and the Balkans indicate selective reinforcement, reflecting the limited resources available to defend a widely dispersed and politically fragmented territory. Fiscal strain and demographic pressures posed persistent challenges. Population losses from the Latin occupation, combined with repeated outbreaks of plague, reduced labor supply and agricultural output, weakening both revenue and provisioning for the military. Coinage records and tax registers show continued efforts to standardize currency and extract revenue from surviving economic centers. But these measures were insufficient to restore the empire to its pre-1204 strength. Revenue shortfalls limited the emperor's ability to maintain permanent garrisons, recruit mercenaries, and fund long-term infrastructure projects. Internally, aristocratic power and factionalism complicated governance. Prominent families exercised influence over provincial administration, often acting independently of central authority. Michael VIII's efforts to consolidate control through appointments, strategic marriages, and selective suppression of dissent were only partially successful. The resulting tensions created a fragile balance between central authority and regional autonomy, leaving the state vulnerable to both civil unrest and external exploitation. Religious policy served as both a stabilizing and controversial instrument. Michael VIII attempted to reinforce imperial legitimacy by supporting the Orthodox Church, restoring monasteries, and coordinating with ecclesiastical authorities to assert ceremonial and doctrinal continuity. At the same time, negotiations with the papacy over church union were politically motivated, designed to prevent Latin intervention, but provoked domestic resistance. This interplay of ecclesiastical and political strategy underscores the empire's reliance on ideological cohesion to supplement its weakened material and military capabilities. By the early 14th century, the restored empire was functionally smaller and less secure than its pre-1204 predecessor. While Constantinople had regained symbolic prominence, the empire's defensive capacity was limited to fortified urban centers and strategically important corridors. Peripheral territories remained vulnerable to Latin, Turkish, and Serbian encroachments. Chroniclers report sporadic uprisings, local disputes over taxation, and the persistent challenge of maintaining garrison towns with reduced manpower. These structural weaknesses highlighted the gap between symbolic restoration and practical power. Weak foundations left the state vulnerable to internal conflict. Internal rivalries accelerated regional disintegration. The period from 1320 to 1354 saw the Byzantine Empire increasingly weakened by dynastic conflict, economic instability, and regional fragmentation. Following the reign of Andronikos II Palaiologos, successive emperors faced persistent challenges from rival claimants, ambitious aristocratic families, and disaffected provincial governors. Chroniclers, including John VI Kantakouzenos and Nikephoros Gregoras, document repeated civil wars, often fought over succession disputes, with battles fought across Thrace, Macedonia, and parts of western Anatolia. These conflicts drained the imperial treasury, depopulated towns, and diverted attention from both external threats and essential administrative duties. Economic pressures compounded political instability. Trade, previously a cornerstone of Byzantine wealth, suffered from Genoese and Venetian competition. The empire's reliance on these maritime republics for naval support and commercial connections created a dual dependency. While merchants provided revenue and resources, they also asserted influence over urban politics, port fees, and taxation. Surviving contracts and port records illustrate how commercial privileges granted to Genoese and Venetian communities increasingly undermined local autonomy, concentrating economic control in foreign hands. Additionally, repeated outbreaks of plague, declining agricultural output, and the erosion of fiscal infrastructure weakened state revenues, leaving emperors unable to maintain permanent garrisons or fund reconstruction projects. Regional fragmentation accelerated as provincial elites exploited imperial weakness. Semi-autonomous territories emerged in Thessaly, the Morea, and western Anatolia, and local rulers maintained private armies, fortified towns, and independent fiscal systems. These regions frequently ignored central directives, negotiated their own foreign alliances, and in some cases engaged in conflict with neighboring Byzantine holdings. This centrifugal tendency eroded the coherence of the state, reducing the empire's ability to mobilize coordinated defenses and undermining the symbolic authority of Constantinople. The military structure suffered proportionally. The diminished thematic organization and reliance on mercenaries left the empire ill-prepared to counter both internal and external threats. Troop recruitment became increasingly dependent on the support of aristocratic families and foreign auxiliaries, often tied to political bargaining rather than strategic necessity. Accounts of skirmishes and sieges during civil conflicts highlight the inability of the central government to enforce long-term military discipline or maintain effective frontier garrisons. Religious and social factors intersected with these crises. Clerical authorities sometimes aligned with competing factions, while Orthodox communities in peripheral regions exercised considerable autonomy. The empire's reliance on ecclesiastical endorsement to legitimize imperial authority became less effective as local populations identified more closely with regional powers than with Constantinople. Monastic and civic records from Thessalonica, Epirus, and the Peloponnese indicate that local institutions increasingly operated independently, further fragmenting the state's social and administrative cohesion. By 1354, the combination of civil wars, economic crisis, and decentralized governance had created a Byzantine polity that was territorially reduced, financially weakened, and socially fragmented. The empire's reduced capacity for coherent defense and centralized administration left key regions exposed and undermined efforts to recover former territories. Archaeological surveys indicate widespread abandonment of fortifications and decline in urban density, reinforcing the impression of systemic decay. With internal cohesion shattered, Ottoman expansion intensified. By 1453, the empire was reduced to its ancient capital, and time had run out. In the century following 1354, the Byzantine Empire experienced gradual territorial contraction and strategic encirclement by the rising Ottoman state. The capture of Gallipoli in 1354 marked the beginning of a permanent Ottoman presence in Europe, giving them a foothold in Thrace and threatening Constantinople's overland access. Over the next decades, the empire lost control of key fortresses, towns, and agricultural hinterlands, isolating the capital both militarily and economically. Contemporary accounts, including those of George Francis and Doukas, emphasize the empire's shrinking resources and growing dependence on Western allies, highlighting the precariousness of Byzantine survival. Efforts to defend Constantinople were limited by both manpower and finances. The city's ancient Theodosian walls remained formidable, but repair and maintenance were often incomplete due to fiscal constraints. The Byzantine military relied on a combination of small standing forces, mercenary contingents, and volunteers from Genoa and Venice. Naval control of the Golden Horn was contested, with Genoese ships stationed in Galata providing partial support. Chroniclers note that despite heroic local resistance, the city's defenders were vastly outnumbered, and internal coordination was complicated by factional divisions within the court and among the citizenry. Diplomatic appeals to Western Europe were a central component of Byzantine survival strategy. Emperors, notably John VIII Palaiologos, pursued union with the Latin Church, sending embassies to the Council of Ferrara-Florence, 1438–1439, in hopes of securing military assistance. While agreements were formally reached, practical support was limited. Political rivalries, logistical challenges, and declining enthusiasm among Western powers meant that promised contingents were insufficient to reinforce Constantinople effectively. These failures underscore the systemic vulnerability of the late empire, dependent on external allies while possessing limited capacity for independent defense. The final phase of the empire culminated under Constantine XI Palaiologos during the siege of 1453. Ottoman forces, led by Mehmed II, deployed innovative siege techniques, including heavy artillery capable of breaching the city's walls, along with sustained encirclement and blockade. Byzantine defenders utilized the walls, sea chains, and fortifications along the Golden Horn to delay the assault. and civilian and ecclesiastical actors supported defensive measures. Contemporary eyewitness reports describe intense combat, strategic deployment of the remaining troops, and coordinated but ultimately insufficient efforts to repel the attackers. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453 was both rapid and decisive. Ottoman forces penetrated the walls using concentrated artillery bombardment and coordinated infantry assaults, leading to the collapse of the city's defenses. Emperor Constantine XI died in combat, symbolizing the definitive end of the Byzantine political entity. Chroniclers provide detailed accounts of looting, destruction of property, and the subjugation of surviving inhabitants, highlighting the catastrophic nature of the final conquest. Archaeological evidence corroborates widespread urban devastation and structural damage to key fortifications. Despite the fall, Byzantine cultural and religious traditions survived through exile and diaspora. Scholars, clerics, and artisans fled to Italy, the Balkans, and other regions, contributing to the transmission of classical knowledge that would later influence the Renaissance. Orthodox religious practice continued under Ottoman rule, with the Patriarchate of Constantinople retained as a recognized authority, maintaining ecclesiastical continuity even in a subjugated context. These enduring elements ensured that, while the empire as a political entity ceased, its cultural and institutional legacy persisted. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had reached the endpoint of a millennium-long historical trajectory, reduced to its capital and surrounded by an ascendant Ottoman state. Its fall marked not only the conclusion of Eastern Roman sovereignty but also the transformation of Eastern Mediterranean geopolitics, trade networks, and religious authority. The experience of survival, adaptation, and ultimate collapse provides a clear framework for understanding both the resilience and vulnerability of long-standing imperial systems. This final chapter concludes the documentary by framing the Byzantine legacy in institutional, cultural, and historical terms, highlighting how governance, law, religion, and diplomacy shaped a civilization that endured for over 1,000 years.